And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's great to have everyone here with us tonight. It's already a huge crowd. And tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
It's great to see you, the original Batgirl.
It's good to be back. I've missed everybody terribly.
Well, Gotham City needs you. There's no question. Well, here we are on X100, everyone. And this is very interesting because it's also our 3-year anniversary. And we didn't time it that way. It's just the magic combination of things. And the incredible election, which dragged out for X100. So we've been preparing this. X100 is a 3-part episode. So tonight's part 1. And what we're going to get into tonight, the title of it is Ghislaine in the Hot Zone. You might wonder, Ghislaine Maxwell in the Hot Zone? Well, we're going to show you how many of her activities and those of her famous paramour.
I knew you were going to use that word.
Jeffrey Epstein, have everything to do with the Hot Zone and the Atlantean technology and all the deep, strange geopolitics that go on there in the Hot Zone. And we're going to explain all that to you here. Maybe a lot of the ex-people in the audience really understand this, but we're going to go really from the foundations of what that exactly means when we talk about the Hot Zone. Now, we also, the other piece of that is the Atlantean research. Why would they be down there? Why would they be doing this? What's the point? Why all the geopolitics? And as we've been trying to point out, going all the way back to Ernest Hemingway, and of course before that, there's been all these intrigues in the Hot Zone. That is an area between Cuba, the coast of Florida, Bimini, right there, Miami, the Yucatan Peninsula. That whole area stretching out has formed a geopolitical zone. It's formed an intense search for ancient ruins zone. And the third part, which is so crucial and needs to be understood, is land rising. We have to understand the concept of land rising and how when somebody thinks of that, they think, oh, you know, that would seem far out. It would happen over hundreds of years. Well, according to the information that we have now supplied by the mystery schools, land is rising. And it's rising off the east coast of America. And this is going to become quite the sort of, you know, if you thought the Wild West was wild, that land is going to rise in international waters. And everybody wants it before it gets there. And that's where we're seeing so much of this activity. Let us not forget also in the Hot Zone is AUTEC, which when we get into AUTEC, we're looking at underwater Area 51. So there's a large-scale UFO component to this. Earlier this week, I released an interview with Joan Zink, who is the widow of David Zink. And David Zink is one of my favorite Atlantis explorers. And he passed away about a decade ago, but he left behind incredible research around his efforts in the Hot Zone to really get into the Bimini Wall and the incredible things that he found, like pillars underwater that lit up the entire ocean floor and things that were completely unexplained, including the magnetic anomaly that I refer to in the large picture as Apothium, A-P-O-T-H-E-U-M. So we're going to get into that tonight. And but one of the really incredible things that Joan had to say, and I highly recommend you watch that interview, is that the natives there and the people who are indigenous to Bimini, they understand the UFO thing very well. And when she was down there, they just call them fireflies. And they come out of the water, they put on a light show, they take off, they come back. And so it's like a regular occurrence for them. So what's that all about? We obviously have an underground UFO base there at Bimini as well. And then you also have AUTEC. So trying to weigh those things out and figure out what's going on. And then you find these characters, Fidel Castro, deep in the deep state soup, a target with the deep state at a time. And of course, you find all the incredible things that the CIA did from Central America and beyond. But if you go further back, you find people like Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, doing archaeology there. And I think one of the most explosive things that happened in this whole area are the readings that Edgar Cayce gave about Atlantis rising and what that area was all about and why the strange magnetic anomalies, etc. So we're going to get into all that as we go. And in the second half of the show, we're going to be taking your questions. And I know people have been wanting questions recently because I've been doing shows without them. And, it's kind of interesting because I think this focusing in on the hot zone is very timely because I've been reading a lot about politics going on in this area. So when we come at it from this angle, so many people have looked into the work, and the scandals around Epstein and Maxwell, but do they really understand what they're looking at? And they've done a really good job, actually, uncovering many of their connections in the spy circles, etc. But to just dismiss this as some kind of orgy island spy ring is a really big mistake because Epstein, as we find out, was really, really big into eugenics. And that's a big piece of this Atlantean cult as we go forward and we start to measure out the different groups, Belial and Emilius. So this is also crucial. Now, I have, during these 100 episodes of the X series, done a series on the hot zone. And it has the Hemingway, JFK, Cuba connection about the ancient ruins and how Edgar Cayce is connected. I'm going to recap some of that tonight. But those episodes are there. And if you want to know more and go deeper into the hot zone, then that's your kickoff point. Okay. And so before we get started with everything, how's the temperature out there?
Excellent. Everyone is so grateful that X100 is finally here.
It's great to see everyone out there.
It is.
And the amazing thing is, when you look at the episodes as we go, we actually haven't done a X series episode since October. We've been doing a lot of political reports and things in the X, kind of X addendum episodes. But the X series is all about X-steganography, and this is something that I found when I was looking into, it was really some of those early UFO researchers and how they had brought things forward about the Men in Black and so on. I started to notice that a lot of the programs, the advanced programs, were named X, like the X-15, etc. And the more I went into it, I would find the programs for different types of aerospace accomplishments, and they were going underground and they were resurfacing with the X titles. So they would start off as something like Blue Gemini, go underground, and then resurface X-20 or something of this nature. So it started to make me wonder about what the X was all about. And then the more I tracked into it, I found a couple of hundred examples of this where they were moving technology through these different government agencies using steganography. Now, steganography in brief is just the way of being able to show something without showing everyone else the thing that you're looking at. So it's not quite cryptography, but steganography, according to some of the earliest people who used it, is something that the Greeks described as a page within a page. And you see it referred to in all of these software programs, and hackers use it and all this kind of thing now. But in earnest, what steganography does is it's out there in the open. It's something everyone can see, but only certain people understand what it is. So in the old days, it used to be the initiates. In medieval times, when they wanted to transfer messages from, different churches, they would use this steganography. And we've seen very elaborate cryptography, but very often cryptography would be identified and people would try to crack the code and so on. The way steganography works, it's just something that would be out there and you wouldn't know that you were looking at a puzzle. So it is for those who know, and applied into the programs that we've been looking at in the aerospace programs, the X-steganography formed a way that they could move projects along without informing everybody what was going on. So if you're in the CIA and you have some 10,000 agents, you need to sit down. You don't have to tell them every little detail about the project. You can brief them and just say, I want you to watch for these particular designations. So this is where the X-steganography came from, and that went much deeper. But when I was trying to figure out where they originally got it, it went even deeper than that, because I started to realize that the mystery school groups had used it. Sir Francis Bacon had used it. The Knights Templars had used it. You see a lot of investigations around the hooked X and things like that. Christopher Columbus used it. And then I went further back. Pythagoras was using it. And they were using it as a way to, again, move secrets and secret information and secret knowledge through these mystery groups. But I found it went all the way back to the Book of the Dead with the Egyptians, and then it seems to relate directly to this disaster in Atlantis around 10,000 BC and the intense technology that was used to basically blow up half the world in that period. It's kind of one simplification way of looking at it. And, the way that Plato talked about Atlantis, he said it was destroyed in a day and a night. So we have to think about the power of this thing that was used. So I call the effect, instead of just thinking of it as a massive cataclysm or upheaval, I think of it as an effect that was released. And that's why we have so many after effects and anomalies like the Bermuda Triangle, where things seem to slip off into a different dimension. So that gives us some way to look at this. There's a kind of reality distortion field that was created by these Atlanteans who were technologically advanced. Well, where does that leave us? When we're looking at Atlantis, there's a lot of theories, of course, but it is the mystery school work that brought it forward in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And they used people like Helena Blavatsky, and they used people like Edgar Cayce to give us that information and see, will you piece this together? Do we have to hit you over the head with it? And they knew that we were moving into this phase, and most of these types of secrets were kept in the mystery schools. They weren't let out for the general population. There were things like Shakespeare, for example, which always has lots of steganography and lots of deeper ideas in it. And that's something that the general public could share. But when we're looking at what happened in terms of steganography, by the time you get to 1840, according to Rudolf Steiner and the Anthroposophical Mystery School, the groups inside the schools had to decide, well, the scientific materialism is taking over. And so what we need to do is we have to release some of this info and let the public fight it out and inject that spiritual nature back into people, because in 100 years, we're not going to be able to recognize humanity. And this is exactly what started to come on with the scientific materialism. Their whole point was, if you can't measure it or weigh it, it doesn't exist. So therefore, that would ruin, any concept of spirituality. It would separate us from the most essential parts of our humanity. So this is like an early transhumanism. If you think about it, 1840, it only took them 170, 180 years to actually think of getting rid of us and replacing us with cyborgs, which you see so much right now. So that gives us an idea coming in of how this stuff got out. And suddenly, for example, in the West, in America, we started talking about things like reincarnation. These are Eastern concepts, but they're getting released into America by the mystery schools because Christianity originally held reincarnation as a tenet as well. So that kind of mystical Christianity was starting to come in. And you do have these groups getting hounded for bringing this out, because a lot of those schools were adopting a kind of negative use of this hidden information, and they had gained political power in places like America and in Europe. So there was a battle there of the mystery schools, which is pretty well described by Rudolf Steiner, I would say, in his various lectures. But what came out of it was basically two divergent paths of these mystery schools. And what happened was, at around the turn of the century into the 20th century, there was a large technological boost from people like John Keeley and from Tesla. And on the Keeley side, the Theosophical Society decided not to move forward with releasing his technology to the public because they saw things like World War I coming, and they were like, these people are going to destroy each other. So there's a huge throwdown where Keeley dies, and the partner ships all of the material off to Annie Besant, who was leading the Theosophical Society after the death of Helena Blavatsky. So all of this gets us into understanding where these things are coming from. By the time we get to Edgar Cayce's work, and he's talking about Bimini, and he's talking about Atlantis rising there in the hot zone, that whole key that's being given to us is something for this time, this period that we're in. Because one of the major predictions that Casey makes is that land is rising off the East Coast. When that land rises, not only does it cause inundations in other places, but it shows ruins. It actually reveals things that were there. So one of the things that Casey gave a series of readings originally for a business group who were looking at Bimini as a place to do as kind of a resort. And what happened is a second group took over and they took him down to Bimini. And they asked him to go much deeper on the whole thing about Bimini Atlantis, which he did. And then he started to have blocks in these readings. I couldn't figure out what was going on. The second set of readings on Bimini, actually, there's no copy of. So this is very interesting because the first version we have, and he talks about how Poseidia, which was a major center in Atlantis, was right there at Bimini, and that a sunken portion of the temples of Poseidia would rise. And he said, look for the first parts of it, 68 and 69, and we did get the Bimini Wall in that period. So now this business group is very interesting to me if you go back and really study it, because the Casey readings, from 1919 on, they don't disappear. They always keep a copy. There's some lost readings before that. So this was obviously stolen, which also makes me wonder. And the business group itself became very sketchy and basically disappeared. So whatever information that they got, they were very curious about it. Years later, after the group stopped communicating with Casey, Casey did a series of lectures in New York City, and the people from that group showed up in the audience. And Casey was there giving his lecture, and he's looking out and he's like, oh, there are those guys that I gave readings to on Bimini. I guess they've come back and we're going to talk more about this. And when he gets off stage, they're not there, and he never sees or hears from them again. So those people, in my opinion, were part of what we're going to talk about in terms of geopolitical forces in the hot zone, looking to find out this angle of how to get in there. One of the things we've pointed out in the X series is the role of Ernest Hemingway in locating these ruins in the hot zone. Now, the reason that we refer to it as the hot zone is when I was looking into this and in the areas of where the ruins are, especially through Polina Zalitsky's work, where she had found a city off the coast of western Cuba underwater. And one of the things that I found that kept coming up in my conversations was that these people who would go into these areas mapping ocean floors, they would all have to sign NDAs so that they wouldn't be able to reveal this. And that would be military, that would be private contractors, whatever it happened to be, people prospecting for oil. They would have to sign for these companies and for these different designations of working underwater, that if they ran across ruins or if they saw large structures, they couldn't reveal what they saw. And they could, if you were in the military, you could be court-martialed for it. You could be sued. There could be criminal charges if you were a civilian. And over again, that term, the hot zone, would come up. So this area there between Cuba and Bimini and Miami and the Yucatan Peninsula and down through the Caribbean is referred to. Those people who work there understand the term the hot zone. This is where if you go down there and you see something, you can't reveal it. So that was a major breakthrough for the work that I was doing, because I had always been deep into Casey's reading, trying to figure out what he was talking about, Poseidia and the temple rising there. And also the fact that he was talking about this two-eye crystal, which basically was the Atlantean power station in this area. So a lot of things didn't add up for me, and I knew the intense, consider the Cuban Missile Crisis and other political flare-ups that have taken place in the hot zone. It made me wonder about the deeper geopolitical levels. And the more I got into it, the more information came forward. And so the piece about Hemingway was quite fascinating, because what I learned was that Hemingway actually got readings from Casey, and that the Caseys were very close to the Hemingways. And that this had all started through Mary Hemingway, who was a very spiritual artist and mother of Ernest. And she became close with Edgar Casey and his family. As a matter of fact, there's a letter there at the ARE, which I've seen, which is, and I have a copy of, which is Hugh and Casey writing to his mother and saying that he is going to be spending a month with the Hemingways in Chicago. Now, when you think about the level of friendships that you have, you might spend a weekend with a casual acquaintance or even a friend, but how good of a friend do you have to be to spend a month with somebody? That's a pretty close relationship. So then we have Casey giving these readings on Bimini, and then we have Ernest Hemingway showing up, and he's living in Bimini. And there are all these good stories about why he's there. Well, he loves the fishing, and okay, fine. But it's interesting that his focus there seems to be to go out in that water and look at the ocean floor over and over again. It's just staring and studying. When they ask him, what are you doing? He said, I'm looking for Nazi U-boats. Seem unlikely somehow. So Hemingway has us going into this, and then he spends all this time in Cuba, and he becomes an anomaly for our own CIA. And then they say, well, they accuse him of setting up his own intelligence network. And then we find him working with the OSS. And very interestingly enough, early on, we find a very young John Kennedy there at that time as well. So there's a lot of strange things, like the letter to Hemingway that supposedly Kennedy never sent, that they found among his Harvard records. But there's a lot of suggestions there that very early on, whatever intelligence unit was looking at this stuff, John Kennedy and Ernest Hemingway were both involved in it. And later, Kennedy would risk a national security incident in order to get Hemingway's vault out of Cuba after his death, because when he had to leave Cuba, he left behind much of this information about Atlantis. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode 100, and it's Ghislaine in the Hot Zone. I'm going to give you some foundation before we bring in the major players of Ghislaine Maxwell and her very interesting friend there, Jeffrey Epstein, of course, who Epstein didn't kill himself, became quite the meme.
Indeed, and still is. Mm-hmm.
How's it going out there?
It's going great.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great crowd out there tonight. I think that what we're going to try to do with these 3 episodes is literally give you the complete outline of all the research that we've been able to do and encapsulate those 100 episodes. I would say from all the episodes we've been able to put out of about 100, that it's still less than a quarter of the information that I have about all this. So we're finding ways and means of putting this stuff out and different methods. Everyone, I want to also invite you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's really important, where they're throwing everyone off social media. And I remember when I did my first episode, I mentioned this, and they really hadn't thrown everybody off yet. I mean, it was really quite a prediction in a sense. By the time we got around to this year, they had basically thrown everybody off. Somehow we've been spared temporarily, but they've done things. Of course, they've taken followers away, they've taken episodes down, and on Twitter, they suspended us for weeks or whatever. None of that really interests me. I'm just going to continue to do the work that I'm doing. But I think it is important maybe for us all to get on this same page, and so we have a direct pipeline. If you guys are getting the newsletter, which is free, then we'll be able to get you that information, and we won't have the fear when we wake up, did they knock us off the social media networks?
Want to field a question?
Absolutely.
Ted Bredeman wants to know, what do you think of Lynn Wood's claim that Epstein is still alive?
No, I think that, it would seem very obvious that they had to really get rid of him.
I don't think he's very useful to them anymore.
Point.
And once you've outlived your usefulness, they might as well kill you. Although there are some irregularities with the pictures of his corpse and whatnot. But so, I understand where the theory comes from, but really, why would they need it for anything anymore?
Well, what we have to do, remember, a quick rule of thumb of dark journalism is you have the official story, and then you have the counter story, and then you have junk conspiracy. So you have to be able to figure out which one does this story fall into. The official story is, he killed himself in prison. We all know that that's not true. And the camera failed at the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
That's ridiculous. That's the official story. The counter story, which is called a conspiracy theory, is that, he was bumped off either by the government or people involved I mean, basically the government. And many people have brought forward information about that. The junk conspiracy that gets floated out there is like he's having lunch with Biden or whatever.
The theory, I'll tell you, the opinions, it's 50-50 in the ideas realm of whether he's dead or not.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll all find out eventually. But I do feel that in the space, we have to be very wary about junk conspiracy. You remember right up till the point where Trump didn't get inaugurated and Biden did. And you had all these jokers like Simon Parks coming out and saying he's going to be inaugurated. It just was not true. Now, I can sympathize with those people with all the things that they saw, and people being misrepresented on the voting side. And we did many episodes about the election, etc. But you don't want to just fall into that, So there was a lot of people like that. And I think that, people like Wood and all that were just part of, maybe they were getting fed all this information, just spitting it out. I think it's better to have a much better filter when it comes to the information that comes in. I'm very open-minded. And in fact, often the truth is way more fantastic than anything we can imagine. But we also need to beware the hope porn, right? Mm-hmm. And this is part of it also.
Guitar Dave says,
great question though.
I don't think he was so stupid as to not have a quote kill switch. He's kicking back on some other island.
Well, it's interesting about islands because that's going to play a lot into this, because there is a kind of a lawlessness that goes on. But the international waters aspect, as I've pointed out on this show, everyone from John Lennon to Ghislaine Maxwell were involved in buying lots in the Atlantic Ocean for where different places were going to see land rising. And when it rises, remember, it becomes a sovereign nation if it's in international waters. So it's not subject to all this other stuff. Now, who was really, really involved in this? Les Hemingway. Les Hemingway was Ernest Hemingway's brother. What did he do? He set up an island nation. And all it was a plot of ocean waiting for that to rise. And he set up his own stamps, his own nation, declared it a nation, etc. And he got into trouble with the government over doing this as well. But he understood, because Les Hemingway during World War I was a reporter who was in some of the early submarine activity, watching around that area and reporting on it. And he came across those ruins very early. The official story is that he saw a city off Cuba when he was flying in the 1950s. I believe that in his role floating around there in those subs and doing reporting off Cuba, that he was seeing these ruins a long time ago. And I also have put other people in this category, but Les Hemingway in particular, I think is fascinating.
Grandma Tippy-Toe says you can also buy land on Mars as much as a 20-acre plot. I had not heard that before. It's fascinating.
I was not aware of that. I remember the thing they used to do, they were like, name your own star.
Right.
Like, hey, it's only $500. It's easy. All right, since I mentioned Hemingway here, let's get a little bit rolling in the Hemingway department. Of course, incredible author with some really intense, deep secrets, but very politically aware. And he praised the incoming president, John F. Kennedy, shortly before Hemingway's own death. There's always been a lot of things about the Hemingway family, which I've tried to bring forward, but everything right down to the suicide of Margot Hemingway is linked to the pressure rings, let's say, around the things that Ernest knew. And his brother Les Hemingway also, I believe, is associated with this. But the story that really always caught me on this has to do with Ernest Hemingway and the National Security Action document that came out in 2015, which has Robert Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, the director of the CIA, and Edward Lansdale, who's a major special ops CIA guy, all discussing this thing that is to take place at Hemingway's home in Cuba. Hemingway's already gone. He's already left Cuba. So whatever it is about something he left there behind in a vault. So eventually, they decide whatever it is they're going to do in that conversation, they realize that it could risk an international incident, whatever it is. What I believe it was, and they have, people like Arthur Schlesinger, who is a major Kennedy historian, and he was like, I have no idea what they were talking about. So officially, nobody knows what it was. And, they've tried to say, oh, it must have been an assassination thing or whatever. No, it has to do with what Hemingway was in possession of and had hidden in his vault, and that the Cubans couldn't get at. But we also, it was in Cuba, so there's no way to get it back to us. Eventually, that information, that footage, those details, those maps, were smuggled back into the United States on a shrimp boat. And the whole chain of history of that got set up, and it's well known now. That's not just something that I've surmised. It's literally a part of history. But the way that they portray it is that this was some interesting poems and short stories and stuff that they needed to smuggle out of Cuba. I don't believe that they would go to the trouble of an international incident for short stories. It doesn't add up. Also very interesting, if you know the JFK Library, they are the biggest holder of any of Ernest Hemingway's papers, letters, everything. So there's a reason for that. But just to let you know, the Smithsonian there, they did a whole story on this as well, talking about it from this angle, how Mary Hemingway, Ernest's widow, got JFK to get Hemingway's legacy out of Cuba, 1961, the year Hemingway died. Remember, 1962 is the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're going to try to kind of keep these things in mind as we go along. Hemingway himself is very fascinating on the esoteric side, but this relentless hunt in the hot zone for these ruins and the intelligence that's connected with it, to the point where the FBI thinks that he's spying for the Russians. And he himself says that he's spying against the Nazis. Very unusual stuff. His own son will become a CIA officer. And as a CIA agent, his two daughters are Margot and Mariel Hemingway. And they go through tremendous difficulty because of what their grandfather was involved in, and then the son's efforts to kind of cover it up and keep them out of the loop. But there are all these forces around them that create this tension for that family. And as a result, they've had a series of tragedies. So they certainly went through quite a lot. And they were obviously targeted by intelligence factions. Officially, the son there, Mariel's dad, retired from the CIA in '68, but then he just hangs out in retirement for like 40 years. And it seems like one of those things where he wasn't really retired, because, you never really retire from the CIA. In 1961, Mary Hemingway comes to JFK, and he gets the details about what's in that vault. She actually appears at the White House, and it's well known that she came there. Eventually, after JFK's assassination, it's Jackie Kennedy who will take the vault of information that has been smuggled back into the United States and incorporated into the Kennedy Library. That special part having to do with the hot zone and Ernest's secret work there never gets mentioned. So this is part of the stuff that we've brought forward here. Now, so we're getting into the hot zone, and we're down there, and we're dealing now with operations of a geopolitical nature, a nuclear crisis during the Cuban Missile Crisis with Castro and JFK. And JFK really saved us from a nuclear exchange with the Russians at that point by blockading the area instead of bombing it, as many of his aides and the CIA director, Allen Dulles, had tried to set him up to do. So there are a lot of things that took place there, but one of the interesting things that happened in the 1960s is someone named Paulina Zalitsky was recruited to Cuba, and the KGB and people kept an eye on her. And she was an oceanographer, and they were trying to get her to study ocean currents, supposedly. It's my actual feeling that they were aware of these ruins and they wanted her to discover these things. What actually happened was she would end up defecting to Canada. And later, Castro would ask her to come back with her company that did this underwater research. And he said, look, I'll hire you. This is going to be easy. Just come back and I want you to look for Spanish galleon treasure. That's the official story. I don't think that's what he asked her to do. I think he was looking for the city. And what happens is, as she's looking for the Spanish galleons, lo and behold, she finds an underwater city, basically Atlantis, off the western coast of Cuba. Paulina Zalitsky, she's done a lot of incredible work, and she brought it forward so fast and got it out to the public so quickly that the regular media wasn't able to stomp on her theory and get rid of her fast enough. So they had to deal with it for a while. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting articles you can still find is from the Washington Post. This is October 2002. And it says, in Cuban deaths, Atlantis or anomaly. There's the mainstream media covering Paulina Zalitsky's incredible finds off of Cuba. The images appear slowly on a video screen like ghosts from the ocean floor. The videotape made by an unmanned submarine shows massive stones in oddly symmetrical square and pyramid shapes in the deep sea darkness. Sonar images taken from a research ship 2,000 feet above are even more puzzling. They show that the smooth white stones are laid out in a geometric pattern. The images look like fragments of a city in a place where nothing man-made could exist, spanning nearly 8 square miles of deep ocean plain off Cuba's western tip. And there's something very important about that area, San Antonio, Cuba. I'll get into that as we go along. What we have here is a mystery, said Paul Weinzig of Advanced Digital Communication, ADC, the Canadian company which is mapping the ocean bottom of Cuba's territorial waters under contract with the government of President Fidel Castro. Nature couldn't have built anything so symmetrical, said Weinzig, running his finger over sonar printouts aboard the ship tied up in a wharf, Havana Harbor. This isn't natural. What happens is she gets better and better detail on it, and then she says, you know, there's hieroglyphs and pyramids. And the hieroglyphs, she gets questions, oh, you mean like Egyptian hieroglyphs? And she says, no, they're Mayan. So there's a whole submerged culture that resembles the Mayans. These are some of the sonar shots and where it was found. A closer look, which I think does it some justice. Let's see. So clearly pyramid-like structures. But if you talk to Paulina, and I've touched base with her, she may come on for an interview. We've had some very interesting talks, and she's directed me to her biographies and things. But what I will say about her work and what's available there in the public record is that she said, oh, it wasn't just a building or two. It's like a metropolis. There's an entire city under there. That's the stuff that she was seeing. And little by little, strange things started to happen. By the end of it, she would end up in a Mexican jail. And she would have to flee back to Canada and just cut off all that stuff and not deal with the Atlantis search anymore. And it's interesting enough, it was actually the Cuban Navy that was putting strange pressure on her to knock it off. So she had found too much. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep now into the hot zone and setting the stage for the entry of one Ghislaine Maxwell and her very interesting father, Robert Maxwell, and their unusual dealings in that area. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, which is a very important way for us to keep in touch with each other. And basically what we do with it is we just give you about once a week an update on the shows that are coming up, the incredible interviews that we have coming for you. And this spring is going to blow your mind because we have some of the best shows coming, including part 1, part 2, and part 3 of X Series 100, which is what we're in the middle of now. In the second half of the program, we're going to be taking your questions. So you can ask them all in caps. That helps Olivia sort them out.
Mm-hmm.
And Olivia, how's it going out there?
Going great. The vibe is fabulous. It's so nice to be back.
Terrific. All right, so we'll hit questions as we go along here, and we've got some time. Okay, keep the dates in mind. 2001, 2002, then 2003 becomes very important. Okay, sunken city off Cuba. Description: in May 2001, an exciting discovery was made by Advanced Digital Communications, that's Zalitsky's company, who were mapping the ocean bottom of Cuba's territorial waters. Remember what I said about people mapping the ocean floor? There's a part of it that's called the hot zone, and you have to sign NDAs. You can't talk about it. Okay, stones laid out in a geometric pattern. Nature couldn't have built it. Right, a great sunken city. National Geographic showed a great deal of interest in the site and was involved in subsequent investigations. In 2003, key year, a mini sub dove down to explore the structures. Paulina Zalitsky of ADC said they saw a structure that looks like it would have been a large urban center. This is the metropolis, the whole city I was talking about. And that she was going to look for more evidence. What happens is they push her out, and then the strange thing happens with the Mexican incident, and then they basically, it's pretty intimidating to have to deal with that. And you say to yourself, Cuba, the people who've hired me for it are against me on this. And also these other people are against me. You know what? I've had enough, and I don't blame her. But she left behind an incredible record of what she was doing. Remember this, Edgar Casey said, Poseidia, which was the main center in Atlantis, was right there where Bimini was, and that it basically was the whole area. So that area of the hot zone contains the Poseidian relics. Now, let's get a little bit into what was going on down there. Before we really dive into Epstein and Maxwell, I'm going to mention, this is like an early flash on Epstein, and it has to do with something which isn't talked about a lot. Epstein was invited to go to Cuba in 2003, which is the same year as the mini sub dive that Zalitsky takes, which finds the whole city and not just looking at some pyramid type structures. It comes out of the Miami Herald, and it's hard to find this anywhere else but the Miami Herald, and I've looked. If somebody does find other stories about this, let me know. Epstein traveled to Cuba at Castro's invitation, former Colombian president said. That's a pretty good source, Colombian president. Miami Herald, August 14th, 2019. Palm Beach multimillionaire Jeffrey Epstein has been a free man despite sexually abusing dozens of underage girls, according to police and prosecutors. His victims have never had a voice until now. And we all know about the early flurry of stuff around Epstein and how they try to put him away early and how he used his influence to weasel out, and that eventually they got him. But again, what was going on there with that? And of course, the quick suicide. Okay. Millionaire Jeffrey Epstein, who was accused of sexually abusing minors and died last week by apparent suicide in a federal lockup in Manhattan, traveled to Cuba at Fidel Castro's invitation, according to Colombia's former president, Andre Pastrana, who said Wednesday he accompanied him on the trip. There's an eyewitness putting him in Cuba with Castro in the same time loop where Zalitsky is finding and going down with the mini-sub and finding this Atlantean ruins. Amid journalistic revelations about horrifying and reprehensible sex scandals of financier Epstein, a trip of mine on his plane, now this is the former Colombian president talking, a trip of mine on his plane to Nassau, Bahamas has appeared to transfer to the final destination of Havana, Cuba. Invited by President Fidel Castro, Pastrana said in a statement posted on Twitter on Wednesday. Mr. Jeffrey Epstein left Cuba a day or two later. I stayed on the island, he added. So eyewitness account from a pretty solid source that Epstein was there with Castro when this was happening. The trip to Cuba, however, does not appear either in Rogers' records or in the records kept by the Federal Aviation Administration and obtained by the Miami Herald. This trip was hidden, so there wasn't going to be any normal way of finding out. If the Colombian president had let it out, we never would have known that he met with Castro. If Epstein traveled to the island, he might have wanted to avoid public scrutiny since Americans are banned from traveling to Cuba for tourism. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot deeper than that, but okay. It was probably unlawful travel, said attorney Robert Hughes, an expert on the U.S. embargo against Cuba. At that time, there were few categories of unauthorized trips, and it's not clear that he would have qualified under one of them. All right, so this guy with all his connections, none of that stuff applies to him. What it is they have to keep it out of the record because it's very important not to show a connection between Castro and Epstein, especially during this portion of time when the media has to deal with them really finding Atlantis ruins before they get rid of the story and get rid of Zalitsky, etc. In 2003, Castro, who died in 2016, was still president, and Epstein had not yet been indicted. The invitation of the American tycoon would not have been an unusual gesture because Castro liked to surround himself with foreign personalities. Yeah, but usually he had a pretty good reason. So it would be interesting, besides the Atlantean ruins, to figure out what the reason would have been and why it needed to be off the books. In any case, for his part, Pastrana maintained a close relationship with Castro, who became involved in the peace process in Colombia. And of course, Colombia has all the drug lords and everything else. Pastrana said he met Epstein in Ireland at an Academy of Achievement summit attended by Bill Clinton and Bono. Keep that in mind. The event took place June 6, 2002. Epstein's private plane flight records released by one of his former pilots, David Rogers, shows that one of Epstein's jets did arrive in Dublin June 7, 2002, and left the next day with the Millionaire on board. The Colombian politician denied having been at Epstein's now infamous private island in the Caribbean, Pedo Island, as they call it now, off the coast of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. Flight records show that Pastrana was aboard one of Epstein's private planes that left on March 20th, 2003, from New Jersey's Teterboro Airport. This guy's coming out there from New Jersey. It's quite strange. Headed to Palm Beach International Airport. He also appears on the manifest of another flight the next day from Palm Beach to Nassau. Records show Epstein, his girlfriend, and Ghislaine Maxwell. Records show Epstein, his girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, and model executive Jean-Luc Brunel, ring a bell, on both flights. According to the documents, they all returned to Palm Beach without Pastrana from the Bahamas. What I'm suggesting with that, and I think that there's a lot of unusual things going on there, but the timing is locked in directly with the subdive that Zalitsky made, and that Cuba had become interested in basically engaging with people about this. And they were getting ready to also move Zalitsky and her honest research off the map so that they could get this other process going. And remember, his official story was Spanish galleons, so we know how false the official stories are on this. Now, let's think about one of the interesting things that Ghislaine Maxwell was involved in was something called the Terramar Project. We're going to get into that deeply to see what it was about, but essentially it was this whole thing about, ocean conservation and how the ocean is like this nation, and she wanted to get all this environmental people on board, etc. And there's a lot of very key details about Terramar that I'm going to bring forward tonight, including the death of her partner involved in the project, which is also quite strange and isn't talked about very much, oddly enough.
Can I throw you a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Crystal Fire says, I hope none of the black hats have gotten their hands on one of those ancient power crystals. Does this come up tonight?
It does indeed.
Okay.
Really good. Yeah, good. You're ahead of the game. The power crystals are important, and the two-eye stone is, I want you to understand that when we look at the Casey readings in the way that he outlined things, for example, in one of his readings, he said at one point, the Nile River flowed in exactly the opposite direction. And he would talk about land masses and things. And when he was talking about it, it sounded idiotic. And so people wouldn't deal with it. But if you look back, there are people who've traced it really deeply. And over again, his geological readings have incredible accuracy. So when he talked about the Two-Eye Stone being there in that area of the hot zone, it is, it becomes something for us to really reckon with, considering the accuracy of his readings in this field. Okay, here's one of the first TKOs. And it has to do with Ghislaine. And so remember, this is also an important thing for people who follow the X series, which is, if you remember an episode that we did that involved someone named Sanche de Gramont and Ted Morgan. And the episode really got into some details, and it was called Who is Tom Garden? Now, this gets us into Hemingway again, so I'll do a real quick recap on this. In that episode, which hangs out back there, and it's kind of obscurity because no one knew, what do you mean Tom Garden? What's that all about? We did Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule, right? That's the biggest X series episode. I think it's 500,000 views. Mm-hmm. And Tom Garden just hangs out back there, I don't know, 30,000 views or something. No one knew what we were doing with it, but it's a very important piece. There was a period of time when Howard Hughes, who we included in our documentary on X Protect, of course, he was down there in the hot zone as well, but he had been kept so undercover that somebody came out and did an autobiography of his, a guy named Clifford Irving. And, they always call this the greatest fake in history, and he faked out. And there's a guy who calls in claiming to be Howard Hughes, saying it's a fake and all the rest. But there's a very interesting meeting that takes place there between Hemingway and Tom Garden. And Tom Garden turns out to be an anagram of Ted Morgan and Sanche de Gramont, which is kind of the upshot of that episode. But the conversation and the relationship and the things that they talk about, it seems to me there's a lot of steganography in the conversation. And it has to do with Hughes' interest in the hot zone and Hemingway's interest in what they're doing there in the hot zone. And there's that hint, if you really can read between the lines, of this Atlantis research. So we have to keep in mind the anagram and the pseudonym. The pseudonyms are very important, especially in a work like that Irving did. And there's so much detail in Irving's biography of Howard Hughes that although later he would claim, and make a deal in prison and all the rest, because I'm sure they wanted to bump him off, he had incredible details of Howard Hughes. And I believe that many of the things that he put on the record about Hughes' biography were absolutely true, including his close relationship with Ernest Hemingway. So what happens out of all that is we start to think pseudonyms, how do the pseudonyms apply, and how they're important in stories like this. So Ghislaine, when she was caught in New Hampshire, not very far past the state line, and when she was floating around after Epstein was caught, we'd hear reports right here in the Harvard area about her hanging out in different places, cafes, meeting with people. And in fact, she was here for much of the time. In fact, Terramar's address was in Woburn. And where would you say Woburn is compared to Cambridge? Maybe about
20 minutes.
Yeah, it's close. So all of her activities were right here. So she gets grabbed in this New Hampshire, while buying this New Hampshire mansion. And it's very interesting. There's the headline. Ghislaine Maxwell posed as journalist when buying New Hampshire mansion. But if you go into it a little bit, something very fascinating comes out. Ghislaine Maxwell posed as a journalist named Janet Marshall to secretly purchase the sprawling New Hampshire hideaway where she was arrested, according to prosecutors. Janet Marshall is a very important activist who had joined the Communist Party and was around in the 60s and 70s and had been persecuted and was really a kind of a famous feminist character, but just the type that Ghislaine would lock into and use the name. There's an incredible hint with the name. But there's something much more fascinating about Janet Marshall. which is that Janet Marshall's actual name is Janet Atlantis Marshall.
For real.
That's her actual name. Think about it for a second. Janet Atlantis Marshall. Do you want her mother's name?
What is it?
Atlantis Octavia.
You're kidding.
Which Atlantis 8, for those of you out there who are into Latin. She married a writer named Stevenson, but she wrote a series of books under the name Marshall, which I tracked down her name on these, and I tracked down the plays that she did. There she is, Janet Marshall, Janet Atlantis Marshall. If you can read those, there's a series of them, 14 books that she wrote, and a good half of them under this name, Janet Atlantis Marshall. On her death record, we see here Janet Atlantis Stevenson's the married name, Marshall's the maiden name. There it is. And right here, if you're looking, it is Atlantis Octavia McClendon is the mother's name. There's a fascinating kind of head fake in all of this, which is there's a nod when she's doing business as Janet Marshall to this much larger people and groups around this Atlantis story, including the fact that Janet Marshall, her husband, was part of the Taos, New Mexico artist group that include Ansel Adams. And those people, many of them belong to the Halcyon Theosophy Temple, which we've covered on this program, which during that period of the 20s and 30s was a major center of Atlantean thought. You know, they knew all about Atlantis and they had tried to bring this forward. An interesting character who comes out of all of that and was part of the Halcyon Temple was a guy named Henry Wallace, who happened to be FDR's VP. So this is where the information takes us instantly into geopolitics for it.
Which is why this being X100 makes so much sense, because it is connecting so much.
It does.
So many of the dots that you've laid out in the last 3 years.
It really does. And Janet Marshall, the story only gets more interesting as we go. And when we look really closely at the real Janet Marshall, Janet Atlantis Marshall, there's so many unusual things about her that it would take up half the program to get into that. But the key piece is her being deeply involved in everything from the McCarthy hearings to supporting writers, hiding writers, and in the 60s and 70s being a major communist. This type of feminist force having those roots in Atlantis, where this is getting kind of passed down as a name, the mother's Atlantis Octavia, and then the daughter is Janet Atlantis. And then later, Terramar's president, Ghislaine Maxwell, is using Janet Marshall's name. So we're going deeper now, and we're starting to see, it's going to become clear when we get into the Terramar part, why this becomes so crucial.
Is there any significance to the name Octavia?
Well, that's interesting. The only thing I've been there's a book, what's understood when people who study Atlantis really, is that Atlantis is the 8th continent. So when people refer to Atlantis, it's always, there's an 8 involved because one of the major books by Charles Berlitz, who comes into this picture, and Charles Berlitz was the major Atlantis researcher. He did the incredible books. He did the first Roswell book, but he did the incredible books on the Bermuda Triangle, in Atlantis, the 8th continent, which is his biggest book. That's where the Octavia part really kicks in. And he, comes up as a very mysterious figure because he also worked in intelligence. And here he is bringing the Atlantis story together. Let's do a little bit on Berlitz, since you mentioned him there, and he's going to become so key. There is Berlitz and his grandfather, Maximilian Berlitz. Take a good look, because Maximilian's very important, and Berlitz is very important when it comes to the Maxwell story. And I'm going to tell you how. One of the key things is that Berlitz became the CEO of his grandfather's language business at a certain point. The point that he became the CEO of the business, Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's father, purchased the business. And as a matter of fact, before Maxwell's death, the thing that he was accused of, that he was supposedly going to go to jail for, was defrauding $200 million from Berlitz. It gets very interesting. Let's take a quick look at Berlitz here. Berlitz was born in New York City. He's the grandson of Maximilian Berlitz. He founded the Berlitz Language School. As a child, Charles was raised in a household in which, by his father's orders, every relative and servant spoke to Charles in a different language. So immediately they're setting him up for this incredible polyglot career. In adulthood, he recalled having had the childhood delusion that every human being spoke a different language. He began working for the family language school, the Berlitz School of Languages. During school breaks, the publishing house, of which he was vice president, sold, among other things, tourist phrase books and pocket dictionaries. I mean, the Berlitz stuff is still all over the place and is fundamental for many travelers. The Bermuda Triangle aspect becomes very important when we're looking at Berlitz, because he becomes fascinated with Atlantis, but he has this big background in intelligence. So we start to see, is this a feigned interest, or is this something where the CIA is trying to control this? Because we know that there's so much involved with the key Atlantis people, the people who really know about it. As I've pointed out in this program, Edgarton Sykes, for example, was a British intelligence agent, and he gave us the best information, really, and did the most complete research on it. But Berlitz's books are powerful, and they have deep, deep information. As a matter of fact, when I was talking to Joan Zink about her exploration with her husband, David Zink, she said that, well, actually, Berlitz was not a very nice man. And he would do things like show up during their expeditions, film them, and then take their psychic interrogator, put her on a TV program. And, he would do these things that would really give rise to the idea that maybe he was up to something else. He wanted more of a narrative about Atlantis. However, his deep interest in Atlantis shows us this connection with Maxwell, because he's working directly for Robert Maxwell when Maxwell has bought Berlitz. And of course, it is Berlitz, the company, that will get Maxwell into so much trouble, because he's doing kind of Ponzi schemes all over the place. So when we're getting into this, we're getting a feel now that these people, the Maxwells of the world, know the Atlantis subject very, very well. And Robert Maxwell is a fascinating character on the caliber of like an Onassis. He's sort of a mix of Onassis and Rupert Murdoch. I think that's a really good way to look at him. His rap sheet is lengthy, but he was also a British politician. What's not explained very well is where he got all the money to buy these publishing companies and how they became so huge. And little by little, when you go into the different books about Maxwell, you see the incredible spy career that he had. And of course, on his death, we have hundreds, of people showing up in really famous heads of state. And Yitzhak Rabin, who was the former prime minister in Israel, said he did more for Israel than can ever be talked about. So he obviously has this reputation.
What's your interpretation of that? Be honest.
I think that he was a spy and fed information to Mossad. But I think that, he has to be honest. He is actually buried in Israel, in Jerusalem. So there's a lot we're going to get into with Maxwell. We've really just touched the surface with him. I'm going to get back to him real quick. I want to answer your question about Octavia.
Okay.
And this brings us into Wonder Woman. I remember something really interesting about Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman, the whole thing is set in Atlantis. But what we have to remember is Wonder Woman's very old. This is a World War II comic. And again, in terms of popularizing things, it's easier to trade stories and move information around when you have a vehicle like this. So the original, November 1944 comic Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman investigated issues with the proper functioning of the transatlantic cable. She never expected to uncover underwater palace intrigue that threatens the very stability of the kingdom under the sea, Atlantis, and perhaps an entire world already embroiled in global war. Queen Octavia of Atlantis summons her. So there you have the Octavia Atlantis thing being written in a comic book in 1944, and we have Octavia Atlantis actually born way back there, and she will have a child named Janet Atlantis. So way before any of this stuff. So what are we getting with Octavia and Atlantis? This has to be kind of fleshed out a little bit. That's the original comic there, and I did get my hands on an electronic copy of it. And it is very, very interesting. And when we see all the Wonder Woman stuff being thrown around now, like Wonder Woman 84, it just seems like perfect timing.
I love Wonder Woman. Almost as much as Batgirl.
What was the last big one that had the Godzilla movie had all that stuff going on too, where it had those incredible connections.
What, with Atlantis?
It did. And it had this whole thing where he was going to like fire off missiles from Fenway Park. And we're like, what? That's ridiculous.
You know, they criticize Atlantis a lot, but man, did they use it.
Yes.
You know, as
no
far
question.
as mainstream pop culture.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It is fascinating because the Plato story, you know, you have all these historians saying, well, he wanted an allegory, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't tell it like that at all. Mm-hmm. He says, you know, I got it from a relative named Solon, and, you know, this is a priest in Egypt, had the story, and they had kept it on the books for 9,000 years. Okay? I mean, it's pretty deliberate the way he talks about it. And he's talking about a very advanced culture. And that's really where we get the first core of it. Edgarton Sykes, this is one thing I want to point out about him since I mentioned it. There's Edgarton in his Intel days. And Olivia, can you hand me that? Thank you.
The red pen.
Gracias. I don't know how it got so far away. That is Edgarton there. Edgarton Sykes produced the most scientifically concrete evidence for Atlantis and the deepest research, and got the best linguists, the best scientists, and the best researchers together. He had a monthly journal called Atlantis. He edited Atlantis books like Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. He was deep in there. He had a 3 decades long career in the British intelligence. And what he said very openly was that everyone knows those ruins are there. China is involved in looking for them. Venezuela is involved. Cuba is involved. The United States is involved. And there's a huge standoff about it in those ruins. And one of the things that he pointed out that would completely change history is that there was an entire Isis temple in the Bahamas. Now, apparently, the way that this works is that these people are, you know, they're all kind of jockeying for position. So like some of that city off of Cuba is in Cuban waters. So they get to really, you know, that's a very tricky situation for the United States looking at that. And then it's a tricky situation when it gets outside of Cuban waters for Cuba, because then it goes into international waters and other groups can take a shot at it. So the United States and the Central Intelligence Agency, understanding the importance of ancient ruins and also potential power sources, and what I've talked about with Joseph P. Farrell as archaeological wars, they want to know. So let's listen first to maybe the reason why all these people are engaged in the hot zone, coming from Casey's Two-Eye Stone research, and then get into what Ghislaine's Terramar force was doing down there. And a little preview is something that Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's dad, was in charge of, called Atlantis 2, which is one of the first journals that he put out as part of Pergamon Press, which is something he headed up with 75% of the stock holdings. Deep sea research and oceanographic abstracts. one of the most key ones that he puts out is Geophysical Investigations in the Eastern Caribbean, February 1955-1956 Cruises, Pergamon Press. And there's a lot of, going into the depths of 2,500 fathoms and so on. And you could read it and just say, this guy is into geology. Certainly could. But I read it a little bit differently. And since we were doing, we love to do anagrams around things when they come out. Pergamon is a city off Turkey, and it comes up with some ancient. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting because the whole story that comes out about this character, and I want to say his name correctly, Hellanicus of Lesbos. He's the writer of Atlantis, which is a poem about Atlantis after Plato puts out his Atlantis story, and he is born. He actually dies on Pergamon in 400 BC. Yes.
Seven Synesthesia says
Yes.
Pergamon is the prophesied site of the return of Lucifer to Earth.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Wow.
Well, that's very interesting. Does that come out of Alice Bailey's work? That would be interesting to see the source on that. I would love to talk with you about that. Great addition there from the Ideas Room. So in going into this, they talk about the Gulf Stream water and then talking about a very deep study of the Sargasso Sea. Sargasso Sea is something that Casey pointed out was a major sunken area of Atlantis, and in ancient times, or even in, just kind of Columbus type style times, they knew to stay away from it because it was so hard to get through, because there was still so much mud and rock and everything else there. It's interesting to me that that's what he's studying in this. So this game is playing out, and people like Maxwell are becoming very closely linked with a scientific group that is studying all this. And the people that Maxwell gets involved with and publishes Science Digest with include Charles Darwin's grandson, whose name is Charles Darwin. Now, I just want to take a little detour into Darwin for a moment. Darwin is very obsessed with X-rays and crystals, and his whole family ends up being experts at something called crystallography. Think about Casey's description of the two-eye crystal again. Then let's think about Maxwell now, Ghislaine's dad, through Pergamon, publishing things from Charles Darwin's grandson. And this is the work, crystallography. I'm going to describe it to you and what it is. So we know that crystals power so many things in our modern world, but this is even a deeper, stranger level. X-ray crystallography, XRC, is the experimental science determining the atomic and molecular structure of a crystal, in which the crystalline structure causes a beam of incident X-rays to diffract into many specific directions. By measuring the angles and intensities of these diffracted beams, a crystallographer can produce a three-dimensional picture of the density of electrons within the crystal. From this electron density, the mean positions of the atoms in the crystal can be determined, as well as the chemical bonds, their crystallographic disorder, and various other information. This gets so deep, but this crystal work that's being done by the scientific group, of which Darwin is a part, but it's a much larger group, is being published in the 50s by Pergamon Press. One of the anagrams of Pergamon also is German op, which, but I think that's just a lark. It's interesting when we think about this, because they're getting into this crystal work, and who was leaving behind this work about the two-eye stone and the Atlanteans? Casey in 30s and 40s was giving all of these Atlantis readings. And these guys seem to be aware of it as well because they have their own mystery school connections. They want to know how the Atlanteans did it, but they also want to know where are their crystals now, 10,000 years later.
Can I throw something out there?
Yes.
Okay, Shashakila said Pergamon was the second largest library in the world, only exceeded by Alexandria.
Fascinating.
Just fascinating. Daniel
Yes.
Browning says crystals can hold a tremendous amount of information, rather like hard drives.
Fantastic points. And I think that's where a lot of this gets to. But remember, what's weird for us to consider is that Casey was saying there's two groups there in Atlantis, the Belial group and the Emilius group. The Emilius group are using the crystal for spiritual interaction in the outer spheres. So they're contacting spiritual entities through the technology. So it'd be like you and I opening up our laptop and, having a session with an advanced being. And the Belial group is using the two-eye crystal for dominating their neighbors. So they're coming in and they're saying, we want to take this territory, and if you don't do it, we'll burn your forest and that kind of thing. So very different applications here, and it's the war between the Emilius group and the Belial group. One wants to use it for spiritual purposes. The other one wants to make a kind of transhumanist paradise for themselves while blowing up everybody else. Sounds familiar. This is what we're looking at. And this is the replay that we seem to be caught up in the middle of as well. So this is the crucial aspect of understanding this. Let's really take a look here at what Casey said about the two-eye crystal. This is Casey, based on his descriptions, which are very scientific. A NASA scientist decided, I'm going to make a scale model of this thing, what it would look like and what it would be. And he made that. This is the way Casey described it, as a six-sided object that through the refraction of stars would produce power and was acted upon by the sun. So here's a key to what the problem is in all the intrigue around the HotZone and why they're so concerned with it, why Terramar's down there, why the cities, all the kind of geopolitics that are going on there, why there's such a major thing going on about it. Here's a question that was asked of Casey in April of 1932, when he's talking about where the records are of the Atlanteans, which include records of how to build the two-eye stone. So he talks, as everyone knows, about the records that are under the Sphinx. And he talks further about a temple that is off of Bimini that has sunk, and that when it rises and we have a chance to look at it, that's where the other Hall of Records is, and there's one in the Yucatan. So they say, in which pyramid or temple are the records mentioned in the readings given through this channel in Atlantis in April 1932? That's the question. Casey answers, as given, that temple was destroyed at the time there was the last destruction in Atlantis. Yet, as time draws nigh, when changes are to come about, there may be the opening of those three places where the records are one, to those that are the initiates in the knowledge of the one God. The temple built by Iltar will then rise again. It's sunk off of Bimini, and it's rising again. This is the message of it. So we have all these people jockeying for position for this thing that's rising. This is part of the land rising off the East Coast, which is such a crucial piece of all the battles that we see going on. And then he talks about there will be an opening of the temple or Hall of Records in Egypt, and those records that were put in the heart of the Atlantean land may also be found there. They have been kept for those that are of that group. The records are one. These records are the ones that are in Bimini, the ones in Yucatan, and the ones in Egypt. They're all the same. They were just stashed in three different places. And there's no doubt that on the Egyptian side, the pyramid and the Sphinx are, the major gateway to that. And then the Bimini Road, the Bimini Wall, that's the area where the temple is rising. And in the Yucatan, it gets very interesting. I want to point this out because this one is often overlooked because I think it was really hard to get to. But Casey talked about an emblem of the Firestones, of course, being brought to the University of Pennsylvania and what he called the Pennsylvania Museum. And this became very confusing for a lot of people in their search. But this is the emblem where he said it would be in the Yucatan during that excavation. And it's a very interesting picture because he's calling them firestones here. And the idea is that basically at a certain point, these Atlanteans had the two-eye stone, which was the major power station, but then they had the small kind of iPhone version, which was the Firestone. And that apparently is what these people are using here. This is the emblem of the Firestone, which is the mini version of the power crystal. And he said, this is what they'll begin to understand, and that the excavations that take place in Yucatan will give the first answers on that. So he's tying all this stuff together. What happens in the meantime? We get all this incredible, bizarre intrigue in this area of the hot zone. We get bizarre intrigue from Yucatan to Cuba to Venezuela and everything in between, including a lot of wars in Central America. Now, of course, those things were about other things than Atlantean ruins. That's not what I'm saying. But I am trying to point out that this is a key aspect that gets missed, in that the Epstein part of all this and the Maxwell part of taking place in this area, the staging area of the hot zone for these ancient ruins, is a key. We can get a look at this whole thing by looking into this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series episode 100, part 1. Remember, there's 3 parts to this episode. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program, which is coming up pretty soon. And how are you doing out there?
I got a great question.
Yes.
Nena says, could GMAX and Epstein have been using sex rituals to ignite the two-eye stones?
Wow. There is a major, well, it's very interesting. If you go in and you really look at Epstein's stuff beyond the intrigue of, this guy having orgies on an island and everything else and getting blackmail, one of the things that he was contributing to heavily were eugenics projects. And I have some very strange quotes of his for what he thought he was doing with this. Since you brought up Epstein, that's a really good point, though. The ideas room is on tap. This one is very interesting. And it's well recorded, so this isn't something we have to guess at. This is what I like about the information around Maxwell and Epstein. Between March 17th and March 20th, 2006, a 3-day conference was held at the Ritz-Carlton on St. Thomas Island focused on gravity and black holes on St. Thomas Island, hosted by Jeffrey Epstein and his Virgin Islands Foundation and the Center for Education and Research in Cosmology and Astrophysics. Attendees to the event, which contained roughly 20 scientists and 21 physicists, included Lawrence Krauss, who comes up here shortly, Stephen Hawking, who they take in the submarine down. And guess what that submarine is called? It's called Atlantis. So
how could it be called anything else?
Think about it. So Epstein's taking these major scientists around to study the ocean floor, whatever strange project he's looking at, and the sub is called Atlantis. Okay. Hawking would later visit Little St. James Island during the conference and boarded a submarine along other scientists chartered by Epstein, known as the Atlantis submarine. Quote, this is Jesse Kornbluth, and he gives the statement to Slate. When we met in 1986, Epstein's double identity intrigued me. He said he didn't just manage money for clients with mega fortunes, he was also a high-level bounty hunter. Sometimes he told me he worked for governments to recover money looted by African dictators. Other times those dictators hired him to help them hide their stolen money. So he's a triple agent. That's what he was up to. This is the level of this guy. When I studied Epstein, it's very confusing because there's so many connections on the top, and people have investigated them in the alternative media very well, I think. But I think the Atlantis part is left out because nobody really has the trail until we start to see this 2003 piece with Castro and we start looking at Terramar. At some point, Epstein became acquainted with president of Harvard University, Lawrence Summers. Remember him? He's the one who got rid of the separation of commercial banking from regular banking so they could commit all that fraud. He was first with Clinton, and then Obama was like, hey, we need that fraudster back, get him back here on the top level. Epstein was promoted and put on the Trilateral Commission. Trilateral Commission is an interesting place to put Epstein. Epstein was a low-level trader at Bear Stearns with not much of an education, but incredible connections. As a matter of fact, he was investing for David Rockefeller. And David Rockefeller said to him, you shouldn't take clients below $1 billion. And this is how he built this incredible business. Of course, David Rockefeller created the Trilateral Commission. They're the guys who dropped in Jimmy Carter out of obscurity as some Georgia governor and made him president in 1976, thinking they were going to manipulate him. But then Carter, because of his own religious background, didn't want to shoot a gun, period. Didn't want to drop bombs anywhere. So he was a big disappointment for them, and they got rid of him in a hurry. So he managed Rockefeller money. This is fascinating to me. Epstein informed businessmen and scientists that he wanted to use his sperm to inseminate women at Zorro Ranch to give birth to his children. He also promotes these groups at Harvard and sends them money. And all the groups have strange names like the New Human and the Human of the Future. These types of names. Very eugenicist-oriented stuff. Once at a dinner at Mr. Epstein's mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side, his acquaintance, Mr. Lanier, said he talked to a scientist who told him that Mr. Epstein's goal was to have 20 women at a time impregnated at his 33,000 square foot Zorro Ranch in a tiny town outside of Santa Fe. Now, it's very interesting because this has that little overhang of like a Joseph Mengele style experiment. It's got a very Nazi Superman type thing going there. The scientist identified herself as working at NASA. According to Mr. Lanier, the NASA scientist said Mr. Epstein had based his idea for a baby ranch on accounts of the repository of germinal choice, which was to be stocked with the sperm of Nobel laureates who wanted to strengthen the human gene pool. So we have an incredible genetic component to the obsessive bizarreness of Epstein. And that genetic component can be very locked in with the kind of Atlantis Belial cult because they're looking for the Superman. And we know that the Nazis looked very much for the Belial Superman as well. And they sent a research team in 1938 to Honduras to look for Atlantis. So this whole thing, you know, their whole concept about Aryan culture is a weird, bizarre misread of deep mystery school knowledge. And this is the danger, of course, when the mystery schools release information, that groups like this take it and run the football down the field with their own theories. But bringing it back to Epstein, this is a crucial piece that gets missed when we just think, oh, this guy was supplying, you know, he became like a pimp to the top level and he got blackmail. It's true. He obviously was able to do these things and for different intelligence services. And there is a great power in that, a kind of sexual deep state blackmail train. However, if we really look at the eugenicist part and combine the Atlantean Belial aspects with it, we get a much better picture of what's happening here. Let's go a little bit further. Okay, the New York Times asking a question. Whatever happened to Ghislaine Maxwell's plan to save the oceans? There's the article. There's actually some good information in this, which is shocking because it's the New York Times. You have to go back almost 30 years to get good information in the New York Times, or at least 25. In 2014, Ghislaine Maxwell spoke at the Council of Foreign Relations CFR event in Washington, D.C. She was there in her capacity as the founder of the Terramar Project, an oceanic conservation group she started in 2012. The CFR is one of the most prestigious nonprofit think tanks. Among its officers and directors were David Rockefeller. There he is again. Colin Powell, Robert Rubin, Bill Clinton, etc. The Terramar Project was an organization with an opaque website and a founder who happened to be the ex-girlfriend of Jeffrey Epstein, the mysterious money manager who, in addition to being one of the CFR's chairman's circle donors for at least 6 years, had pleaded guilty in 2008 to state charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor. Mr. Epstein spent the next year in county jail, becoming a symbol of the super rich getting away with crimes, and seemed likely to send ordinary people to prison for longer. Okay, so Terramar, even the regular media is having a problem swallowing. What is Terramar? What's going on there? And here was Ghislaine taking these incredible trips on these yachts and getting funded by these environmentalists for trying to create this ocean culture. It's good for the environment. One of the strange things that I found here, and it's very intriguing, I don't have all the answers on this one, but I can tell that there's a piece here, which is one of the things that Casey did was he tracked the Amelia Earhart story, and he tracked to where he said her ruins were from where she had crashed. He even identified the general area of the island that it was on. Interestingly enough, 4 people remember Terramar connected. 4 people remember Ms. Maxwell talking of journeying to the center of the Pacific Ocean in an attempt to find, she said, Amelia Earhart's plane and body. This is very interesting to me because I'm becoming more convinced every time we get deeper on Maxwell and Epstein that they're very familiar with the Casey work and very, very familiar and deeply involved in the Atlantis research there in the HotZone. So there's more, and there's a tie-in with the Clinton Global Initiative, but we're going to save that for another time. Okay, now I'm going to move into this other section, but I want you to, if you've got anything you want to add, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, this whole aspect of the conversation just really makes me feel sick to my stomach. I mean, when you start getting into the genetics, the sperm,
I know,
you know, it's so, I mean, all of this is very disturbing, but that somehow that aspect of it really just makes me stop in my tracks. It just,
well, think about it, because who was flying to Epstein Island on a regular basis but Gates? And then think of the incredible, you know, sort of genetic manipulation that he's involved in right now on the entire population under the guise of, oh, we're all getting through this, you know, we have a magic vaccine and all that stuff. And then the incredible lack of testing and the incredible side effects and everything else. So we're looking at really these people, a very small group of people trying to manipulate the masses of people. However, what we can do is start to see what they're looking at, what they think that they have, and what they're actually involved in, as opposed to, you know, so when we look at stories that are going on in the HotZone, when they talk about, well, they've made Cuba a terrorist state again, you know, when our different diplomats go down into Cuba and stay in the Cuban embassy and they're attacked by microwave weapons, and then these people come back and they have sound concussions, and then they say, well, I'm not going to go back there, so we just close our embassy. And then when they come back here, they have the same problems. The harassment is continuing on that level. So we have to understand those things from a different place than just these nations have problems with each other. There's a larger picture behind it, and obviously these people are involved in that deeper crystal research. Now, pointing out again, just so we can stay on tap, that is the HotZone area. You're looking at it off the coast of Florida, Bimini, Cuba, and that western tip of Cuba here, right where that tip is where Paulina Zalitsky found the city off of the tip of San Antonio. And of course, you have the Yucatan Peninsula, which she discovered a kind of a mountain range that connected Cuba to Yucatan at a certain point in time. So you're starting to get the impression there that that second version of Atlantis, you know, you have the main version of Atlantis and the destruction that happens, but then there's something that survives down there. The Poseidian part from Yucatan to Cuba and Bimini is still there, and it's a major center. And they have the healing temples and they have all kinds of things. But the Two-Eye Stone gets misused and it blows up that area and the land sinks. The ruins there, though, are a little more fresh. They're only from 10,000 BC. They're not from these older periods. So this is why this area becomes such a crucial piece. And I don't know if it's fate or what, but what Casey's saying is that's the area that's rising. That's why we're going to become aware of it in the first place. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep now into the HotZone. Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein on his Atlantis sub, and her using the pseudonym Janet Atlantis Marsh. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. And, it's been incredible 3 years of doing the X series, and it's great to really have this 100th episode. I've been doing shows as Dark Journalist for much longer, actually. You can go all the way back, so there's a good 8 years of work out there on this. But this 3 years of the X series, I think, and working with the Ideas Room and all the work with Miss Olivia here, that really has opened up so much for us as well. So we're very grateful for your support. And I want to remind you that we will have some remarkable things coming up, interviews, events, and more, and changes coming up this year. But certainly in the spring here, it's going to be phenomenal. And there's going to be some remarkable shows, including part 2 and 3 of this episode. Okay. I have to go back to the Two-Eye Stone to give us some reference. And then, Miss Olivia, I'll try to get through all this stuff in 15 minutes so we can start with questions.
Okay.
How does that sound?
Sounds
It's
good.
a deal. Okay, in Ezekiel 122 in the Bible, you remember many people who purport to know about, ancient aliens and things like that, they often go to Ezekiel. But there's a very interesting reading in the Casey catalog where they ask him, well, what were these Atlantean ships like? You talk about all these ships that they had, these airships, and the sophisticated technology. What were they actually like? And Casey says, well, they were like what Ezekiel described at a much later date. So this is kind of fascinating. First of all, it's an interesting description. We know the wheel within the wheel, and it is an incredibly technological thing. People often attribute that to ancient aliens, but here's Casey really breaking down the wall and saying, actually, it's exactly like what Ezekiel described. However, somebody had kept one of those ships, apparently, which is what Ezekiel saw, because he's saying, yeah, the Atlanteans had these flying ships, but it's Ezekiel looking at them at a much later date. So that's strange to begin with. Over and over again, Casey talks about how the Atlanteans would come to know the Two-Eye Stone as the terrible crystal because of the misuse by the Belial group. Now, Ezekiel 122 mentions the likeness of the firmament upon the heads of the living creatures was as the color of the terrible crystal, same name, stretched over their heads above. So that terrible crystal line, it still echoes, even in the Bible, in Ezekiel's account. Here's a couple of quick readings sections from Casey on this. Casey's giving a past life reading for somebody. He says, before that, we find the entity was in the Atlantean land when there were the preparations of those things that had pertained to the ability for the applications of appliances to various elements known as electrical forces. In the present day, as to the manners and ways in which the various crafts carried individuals from place to place, and what may be known in the present as the photographing from a distance or the fields of activity that showed the ability for reading inscriptions through walls. That's X-ray. When there was the overcoming of the forces of nature or gravity itself and the preparations through the crystal, the mighty, the terrible crystal. And they put it in caps because that means his voice really boomed when he says it. That's how the readings work. So he's saying the mighty, the terrible crystal that made for the active principles in these were a portion of the activity, the entity in that experience. So there's an echo here of people coming back and having had those experiences around these crystals. In another reading, he gives us an idea how it operates. And he tells us the name and the association with Bimini. He says, for this entity in the center upon a board or paper, we would begin with this. The stone as the light of the activities in the temple in the Atlantean Poseidian era. This is the one just before everything sank, about 10,000 BC. This might be termed the Two-Eye Stone, Tuaoi. This would be a 6-facet stone of the height as to proportion, while the rest of the chart, as may be indicated, the stone of the tuai would be opalescent, while the light would be indicated from the top through the rays of the white light. And then someone asks, what was the tuai stone? What was the shape and the form of it? And he says, it was in the form of a 6-sided figure in which the light appeared as the means of communication between infinity and the finite. You see how he's identifying it. The Amelia's group is going through the crystal and they're getting incredible spiritual enlightenment through it. It's a totally different application. Or the means whereby there were the communication from those forces from the outside. Later, this came to mean that from which the energies radiated, or the center from which there was the radial activities guiding various forms of transition of travel through those periods of activity of the Atlanteans. So it was set as a crystal, though in quite a different form from that used there. Do not confuse these two. So the crystal is set up as a power station in one sense, and they can use it for warlike activities. But this other group, the Amelia's group, is using the same crystal technology to communicate with the outer spheres. It was in these periods when there was the directing of airplanes, means of travel, through these in that time would travel in the air, on the water, or under the water, just the same. Yet the force from which these were directed was the central power station, or tuai stone, which was as the beam upon which it acted. So it's a total power station, advanced technology in Atlantean times. And what he says eventually is the tuai stone causes the destruction of this area. And it does such a short circuit through the Belial group, whatever it is that they do, that it messes up the very magnetic center of the entire Earth. And that takes place there in the HotZone. So there's incredible magnetic anomalies. You know, one of the things when I was talking about the Joan Zink interview that David Zink found was that their compasses were spinning backwards. And he talks all about there are all these magnetic anomalies down there that they've never been able to explain at all. And that all these things that take place in the Bermuda Triangle and in the area surrounding that seem to be heightened around the solstice period. So the position of the sun still affecting that thing somehow. So this is where when the Egyptian priests and those brotherhoods take this information about Atlantis and they move it on through the culture, and the Mayan priests do it, this is where they come up with steganography, and where they use that steganography to hide. They don't want this to be repeated. So the steganography is a way for these high priests and these initiates to understand. And so that part of the story goes very deep. What I want to point out about how precise these readings are with Casey is that he's seeing that culture as it was. And he's also telling us, here are the remnants. But he's also seeing into the future, and he's saying, here's where it's going to rise again. So he's seeing across time completely in his psychic state. And you know, there's very few psychics that can do that. So the work that he was doing was remarkable. And, you know, we've tried to get the very best on this program. Of course, we have incredible people looking into this, like Gigi Young, for example. So that takes us into a totally different level. Now let's go from there. Now that we understand Robert Maxwell being involved in the crystal aspect with Darwin's grandson, now that we understand Epstein and his eugenics aspect involved in his submarine Atlantis with all these physicists and scientists, let's try to connect now Maxwell in a little bit tighter with the Terramar Project and observe some of the strange things around that. A couple of quick pictures that will tell us a lot. That is Queen Elizabeth meeting with Maxwell and her father, and Robert Maxwell showing his incredible connections again at the very, very highest level, as she will operate also on the very, very highest level. There's Maxwell with the Bushes, Bush 1, Barbara Bush, and George, and really getting a handle now on the level that Maxwell is operating on. His death is very strange. he's found nude off a boat about 8 o'clock in the morning off his yacht there in the Canary Islands. Canary Islands is also a major hotspot for people searching for Atlantis. But his last check-in is around 4 a.m. and then there's no check-in. Then the autopsy doesn't look right. He has bruises on his shoulder, and also, what is he doing nude? So there's a lot of strangeness about his death, and he was obviously removed from the picture. And his family, actually, if you look at the Maxwell family, he and his wife and their 9 children, there's a lot of tragedy that takes place in there. When he dies, it's revealed that he has defrauded the Berlitz people and the shareholders of Berlitz of $200 million, no small amount in 1990. So we're starting to kind of get a better feel for who he is. And there are a couple of very good books. Maxwell's Empire, How It Grew, How It Fell, a special report, Charming the Big Bankers Out of Billions, is an article from 1991 in the New York Times that I can recommend on that. So again, just getting us into that. So incredible wealth and incredible deep esoteric knowledge and manipulation geopolitically and otherwise in the hot zone of these issues. So if we can get our heads wrapped around the esoteric side, it's going to give us a much better feel for this. We're going to understand the things that are happening in relation to these major power players, and we're going to understand that so much of it is taking place in the hot zone, which is so crucial, I think. And there are other incredible important hotspots in the world, like Antarctica, and there's a lot of places we don't know much about. But I will tell you that we have a very clear picture from the Casey readings and from various types of research and from things in the X series. The hot zone is something which, again, is right off the coast and it actually includes America. This is something that we can get our hands on, and this is something that we can, watch. And trust me, many of those expeditions in those days, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, were disrupted by, the DEA and stuff. And they have a great excuse, which is there's always drugs going back and forth. But I think that this would prove to be incredibly worthwhile if we were to awaken this research, because the research that people were into at this time, I think, got derailed. So the Sykes research, David Zink's research, the legacy of the Casey work through the mystery schools. This is something I think we can actually get our hands on. I have more to dish out on this, but I'm going to go with Miss Olivia at this point and your questions. So let's jump in there.
Okay. First of all, Cookie Queen says, a close confidant of Bill Clinton, Doug Band, has cooperated with the federal sex trafficking investigation involving convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. This just happened, I guess.
Wow.
So
yeah.
there are still developments there.
There's so much that can come out about it. Although you do wonder, because it was so easy for them to get rid of Maxwell, Epstein, that I think, there's a lot going on. I remember I was reading this article, Ghislaine Maxwell's family slams brutal and degrading treatment in prison. So is she...
Cry me a river.
I know, exactly. But is she headed for an Epstein-style future? Can they work this out so that they can keep her quiet enough? Can they shunt her away into some prison so that this doesn't come back up? I wonder what's going on there. And I know that if they have another sort of, suicide with Ghislaine, this time it's going to look, people already were really, who didn't even pay attention to things in our alternative research world, they even became totally different from that. Yes, Miss Olivia.
So Daniel Jorgensen says, so in theory, Epstein was taking scientists and elites down to the ruins to watch the 2 eye stones go off during solstice?
Well, that's interesting. You could say that, or that they had found something and that they were studying the effects of it being the 2 eye stone. We don't know if they got their hands on it or not. Or
what's your gut tell you?
They're observing this stuff on such a level, and they're utilizing the information on it. Autek is a great hint about this because there's so much UFO activity around Bimini and Andros. And on Andros, you have Autek, and you have the platform there off Andros. Andros is actually a much larger island than Bimini, and there's so much there for us to investigate. But just like Bimini has the Bimini Wall, the Andros platform is obviously a man-made structure from a sunken civilization. So now we run into a very tricky area, because if this stuff is rising at a certain point, they won't be able to say, oh, it's not happening, forget about it. So if it is rising land, eventually the rise is going to be visible. Even the Bimini Wall is only in 15 feet of water now. So whatever it is that's changing in the Earth's position and bringing these back up, it's going to be undeniable. So they have such a head start on it. And I believe that there's more groups than just the Epstein-style groups. I mean, I think the Hemingway aspect, those groups, again, it operates very much like the X-Protect and the X-Share groups that are involved with the advanced technology on the aerospace side. I think that there's a couple of groups looking into this. And I think it's a major geopolitical aspect, yeah.
Debbie McAdoo says, could the big earthquakes that just occurred in the Pacific be prelude activity to the push for land rising in the hot zone? What if the magnetic pole shift that is happening now is related to the current use of these ancient crystals?
Yes, these are the things that are taking place. We're going to see in our lifetimes dramatic earth changes. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think they've been trying to pin the blame on it, on greenhouse gases and the climate emergency and all this stuff, which they're trying to turn COVID into the climate emergency. Have you been watching this? Now that they've got everybody worked
they're
up
rebranding
about that.
it.
Yes. And it's not, what did they used to call it?
It was a climate crisis. But that didn't catch people's imagination. So now they're calling it a climate emergency. And I'm seeing that branding everywhere. There's banners and bumper stickers and all of that.
Yeah, I've seen it too. This is the new thing, right? We're really into it. It's an emergency. Hey, come on. But I do feel like when we look at that, there's going to be a lot of stages of this. First of all, if ruins are rising at a certain point, they're not going to be able to, it's just like the UFO aspect. They're not going to be able to deny it. The sophistication of the technology is too good. They already have things that can see through layers of jungle from the space. I'm sure they've been looking at this stuff with satellites since the 1960s. So they're very far ahead of us. However, it's going to be hard for them to lie about it at a certain point. Now, I think the Casey part is part of a larger mystery school effort to inform the general public. So I can get a book and read his readings, and you can take it or leave it. But you can look at the things that he did, and if you're looking 50 years later, and he's talked about so many things that they can find now, then it gives you more faith in the mystery school work. So for me, the mystery schools that became public, like Theosophy and the Anthroposophical School, Spiritual Science with Rudolf Steiner, the Gurdjieff groups, which also, there's a lot of Atlantis in the Gurdjieff work. If you read Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, he also talks about pre-Sans Egypt. So he also has this larger picture in his work. So it's there. And what they were doing, they were setting us up, giving us the information in the public, working with groups, creating the foundation. A lot of people, when I've talked about this, they say, why don't their mystery groups just come out and, why don't they reveal themselves and just help humanity battle this stuff? And, the mystery schools aren't, they're not institutions. This is the interesting thing that comes up in J.G. Bennett's work, who worked with Gurdjieff. He talks about them as groups that come together, spread seeds for humanity, and then retreat back and let humanity do it. Are there actual mystery schools to go to? Absolutely, certainly. So many of the things, I've listed how those groups operate as well, but there are actual mystery schools, and then there's something called lesser schools. But they are the lesser schools are incredibly valuable and have incredible knowledge. They're just not on the level of the actual mystery school. And then beneath that, you have arcane schools, which imitate. They're like the letter of the law type books. They have all the methods preserved, so it's like a library in a sense, the arcane schools. And below that, you have private groups who get together and study these things. And then finally, you just have public groups, something that you can go out and join. But there is nothing like online, where you see like, here's a mystery school or something like that. It's just, those are just public groups of people talking and sharing ideas. There's a much deeper level of this, but you don't have to be a member of a mystery school to understand these things. That's why they got the information out to the public. You can integrate it into your own life, and the culture itself can be aided by it. I think the mystery school influence was at a great height during the 60s and 70s. And I think that there's been a lot of things to knock that information back. I think we had a greater understanding of things, psychology and the psycho-spiritual side of things. And I think that we've been turned into a bunch of pill popping, vaccine hopping, devourers of commercial culture. And so this, this type of work, I think, gives us an opportunity to kind of remake society and to bring the full holistic person forward, physical, mental, spiritual, together, and not just something for somebody's commercial appetite, where they just harvest people. And, eventually, I think they're at a point now, we've talked about this with people like Catherine Fitz, where they actually want to depopulate humanity. So the leadership is just insane. And we, on our side, need to kind of figure things out for ourselves. Okay, yes.
So Raykar says, if you zoom in on Bimini Island, it gets wonky and parts are blacked out using zoom.earth. Tricky Vicky says, there was an area that rose 6 feet the other day. Those buoys that they have that measure depth are all over the place, and some they took offline because the seafloor was rising and lowering so wildly.
That is really
That is
interesting.
fascinating information.
I've read about more in the Pacific, but no, actually I read one off Spain of these islands that just, let's talk about High Brazil for a minute. This is apparently an island that in ancient maps appeared at times and disappeared at other times, and when they went to look for it, it's kind of a different type of Atlantis story, but it's on so many maps that it was obviously there and visible at a certain point. So it sort of phased out. And, it makes you wonder about dimensional aspects to some of this. But since we're talking physical, I've read scientific journals talking about islands thrusting out of the ocean in a 24-hour period. So there's a lot of hidden volcanic activity under Bimini. This is from the Casey readings. One of the things that is not often talked about is that Casey said, well, if you really examined Bimini, you'd find more gold in circulation there than there is in the world's circulation. Would that make these groups interested? So they have more gold than that's in the world's circulation, plus the Two-Eyes Stone, plus the ancient ruins for reigniting their Belial worship. There's a lot of reasons for these groups to be absolutely over the moon about this. Yes.
On that note, David Termini said maybe the Bimini Road is a magnetic levitation railroad.
Interesting.
I love that theory.
Well, there's all sorts of unusual. If you look at Zink's work, his book is actually quite a groundbreaking book, Stones of Atlantis. When he talks about the magnetic parts, I mean, he goes really deep. He talks even about how all these cultures seem to worship the Pleiades, and he talks about a relationship between Pleiadian beings who aren't physical and humanity. I mean, this is a deep thinker, but certainly the magnetic aspects, all that ties into the apotheum part, because remember, the X technology that is in the UFO file all refers to the same types of magnetic anomalies. There's all these things that get screwed up whenever UFOs are around, and people can walk through walls, and it's all very, so the physics turn upside down, and the groups that are operating and covering these things up, I believe they've been studying it for a long time, but I don't think they can control those types of things. That's why I mean, if you think about it geopolitically in terms of studying who could make a weapon out of these things, I'm sure they have studied it very deeply. And they keep people away from even studying it on any remote level. The media used to really beat down the UFO subject. Now they seem to love it. And that should make us all nervous. Because they found a way, to make it like a corona crisis, false flag type thing. And, so they take things like a medical crisis and they piggyback this whole fascist operation in on top of it. What are they going to do with the UFO file, which they love talking about the UFO threat? Yes.
I have two questions about the capstone of the Great Pyramid.
Oh, interesting.
So,
yeah.
Seven Synesthesia again says, weren't the pyramids gold capped originally? And Mount Plumber says, Daniel, was the missing Great Pyramid capstone, which Dr. Farrell states is quartz, hewn from or alchemically adapted from an original two-eye stone?
There's no question that I feel that the Casey readings are the best overall view of the Atlantean culture. And the Atlanteans came into Egypt. Egypt had kind of a primitive culture in 10,000 BC. And the Atlanteans came in and enriched that whole thing. And he has the story about, Rata, who was actually from the Caucasus, that whole region of Iran. And that group came into Egypt as the Atlanteans were coming in. And so there's a big thing where Rata, the priest, goes and works with the Atlanteans for 20 years, learns all their methods, and comes back to Egypt. So, but it's very interesting because what I've read is that original capstone, when they finished the pyramid, they clanged, because so much of it was an audio experience. This was mostly about sound, and the raising of the rocks and everything had a very had a sound, a major sound aspect to it, and involved chanting. But it's interesting because the capstone is supposed to be where we get the bells in the church, so it's the same type thing. Yeah. So for me, I think absolutely the capstone. And they probably eventually, with the Romans and everything, just took that capstone out and either melted down the gold or took the crystal somewhere.
Oh, this is great. Scruples 4444. Tech. AU equals gold. The amount of gold in the HotZone, it simply can't be a coincidence. What's your take on it?
That's great.
That is great. I'm glad we're bringing up Tech again. I really want to talk to you about this in light of Bob Dean.
Yes.
And what he had to say about the 4 alien races that
look human.
Well, one human. Looked
yes,
for sure.
Right.
And they were concerned that they were walking the halls of
governments
of NATO. And so what is, a lot of people think that Tech is where we are interfacing with aliens, with USOs, and the whole, where does this fit with the breakaway civilization and all this? And how does this fit with Epstein and Ghislaine and all the genetic research, all of that? Well,
I'll tell you this, which is that Tech is harder to get information on than Area 51 is. There's something about being in the ocean, which it's very easy to cover up things, much more easy than just at a military base in the desert. So I would say more whistleblowers and things have come out about Area 51 over time. Tech is incredibly mysterious, and their operations seem to involve UFOs, underwater anomalies, USOs, those UFOs under the water, the fireflies, as the Bimini residents described them to the Zincs. This is very interesting to me because, when I think about what's happening with Tech, there's only been a few people who have come out and they talked really about the work that they did there as a contractor, but it's very, very tight-lipped. And we know that they're spread out from a Miami station through Andros, which is a major, again, site to keep an eye on the Bimini part, all the way to Cuba. So they're right there. They operate They're basically like the special forces operating in the hot zone. So it's very hard to get a handle on what they're experimenting with. But I think that some of the work, if you go back and look at Thomas Townsend Brown, something that's really quite fascinating is when I've spoken to people in his family, they have told me, and I did an episode on Thomas Townsend Brown. I think it's X Series 45. But he used to go to San Antonio with the guy who ran the UFO file. And every year they would go away together for a month. The family's like, oh, he's going to San Antonio. He's going to San Antonio, Texas. It turned out when he died, they found out all these records that he was going to San Antonio, Cuba. And one of the things that they have in San Antonio, Cuba, is this very interesting fine white sand. Oddly enough, Paulina Zalitsky, when she was talking about the ruins, she said, it's interesting throughout those ruins, it seemed to be that they're in white sand. So there could be something. He loved to study sand. And so some of the deeper aspects of what was happening with that research could be what Autek is now the heir to so much of Thomas Townsend Brown's work. By the way, that eventually involved a kind of time travel aspect as well. So I would love more information on Autek. Yes.
Esoteric 369 Wall. Where do you think Ed Leedskalnin fits in with all this?
Oh, he's fascinating. Well, he obviously figured out the methods that they were using for, the great fascination with him is where he got it, right? And so Coral Castle is there, and it's a living testimony to what he could do. He made buildings that were basically kind of like in ancient settlements, like the pyramids. The way that he could move stones, he didn't use crews to do it. He used magnetic energy. It was all very hidden. Years ago, I had a friend who gave me these very small manuals that he used to sell in the 1940s about magnetic power, and that Leedskalnin would make these available for people. And he said, this is how the ancients built their stuff, and they knew it. It has to do with the North Pole and the South Pole. Obviously, he had discovered that method, but there were many clues about what he left behind, but no one seems to ever have found the method for how he did it. And Coral Castle, if you really look at it, it's an incredible achievement, and it's a total anomaly. It's bizarre, and it's in the hot zone. So that's part of it. Yes.
A cult fan. So what does the eighth continent have to do with the eighth sphere?
Well, that's a really good question. When you think about the Atlanteans and you think about the influence of Ahriman, the Belial aspect that Casey brings out is the same spirit. If you read the astral force that's in the readings that Steiner gave and the dissertations that Steiner gave about Ahriman, he talks about it being a force hanging out over Atlantis and trying to destroy them, and then moving to America to try to destroy America. Ahriman's goal in the Steiner work is to get America and the world, to get every leading nation involved in this kind of simulated virtual reality. So when we look at Ahriman, and from that perspective, that he's trying to get everyone into this eighth sphere activity so that when they reincarnate, they move not in that normal, the traditional trajectory cosmologically is that we go from different planets and we learn, and then eventually you exit out of the system. But you come back here and reincarnate. That's what the mystery schools teaches. In his view, Steiner's view, he's saying that Ahriman was interrupting that by having people go into the eighth sphere and then reincarnate here, so they become more and more base and more under the control of these dark astral forces. That's where he's bringing that forward. What's very interesting, and it's just an obscure note I'll mention here about Steiner when he talks about Atlantis, is he talks about that there was a force named Tau that spiritually developed the Atlanteans and helped them dramatically, in that towards the end of Atlantis, Ahriman had imitated Tao and had like basically, it's basically like the Antichrist being the Pope kind of thing. He was imitating it to such a point, and this gives us some hints about the Ahrimanic force, the way that Steiner saw it in his cosmology, that it's very imitative of things, so if we believe, in Christ, or someone believes in Buddha, he's willing to conjure up that type of image and feeling in order to get you into this virtual 8-sphere version. Wow. Interesting. Go ahead.
Frank Monday, are we putting our children at the altar of Ahriman by allowing them to use cell phones?
It doesn't have to be. All the technology can be incredibly useful. This is it. Steiner's work actually is about facing Ahriman. It's about facing the technology. It's not about retreating from it. But the truth is, if you looked back, I actually ran a tech magazine for a number of years, and I was close with every kind of tech wizard out there. And the way that we used to look at it was, this is exciting. We can do so many more things. People can work from home. That there's so many incredible innovations to it. Think about the early period of when they first came out with computers and the things that they could do. And now people could do email and everything else. So it was an incredible boost. And then at a certain point, it became a harvesting operation. They're training AI. They want to take jobs. They want to get you to think a certain way. You can't say a certain thing. The president of the United States cannot say something because Twitter doesn't agree with it. This is a psychotic fascist dictatorship. And if you go deeper on the cosmological side and you say, what is really driving that desire to, keep humanity and just close the fist on humanity and strangle their freedom? It is, the mystery school is giving us this sense, this Ahrimanic sense. The Ahriman thing is interesting because Steiner said it would come through the technology. It's a technological aspect. So I think we've faced evil and war and all these different types of things before, absolutely. But there's something about the high technology getting infiltrated, which, we find ourselves in a place where you don't feel safe when you use technology. So, but I think it is important that we can embrace the technology and it can move the culture forward. Yes.
Guitar Dave says too much blue light, iPhone and screens calcify the pineal gland.
Yes.
Of course. And, we have crystals in our pineal glands, and fluoride dumbs it down also. So everything, it's what it is. And we've known this at least since the 60s. They've been talking about how our consciousness has not kept up with technology.
It's true.
And that's really the problem. And it's still, even, with things like Headspace apps and stuff like that, it's they talk about consciousness, but it's we have a lot of catching up to do.
You're right.
Technology is way ahead.
No question about it. And what's interesting is they're using the technology to actually take us back. It's like it's becoming degrading to humanity. And they're making people neurotic as well, and now they're trying to inject technology with experimental injectables. I mean, they're completely out of control, but they've also lost their
Catherine Harris says they're blinding us with science.
That's great, fantastic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep here now into the hot zone on the Atlantis side. We're taking your questions. And I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, which is a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch, with what I think is absolutely crucial in a period like this, where we're seeing people thrown off left and right off social media, and they're just getting rid of ideas and just telling you what to think. And if you don't think that way, then you're a heretic. Forget it. You want to think for yourself? Really? Unbelievable. Get rid of that person. You must be inciting violence. You want to think. Ooh. Here, remember that there is the Steiner prediction that in America they'll pass a law against thought. So I think that's The domestic
amazing.
terror bill is basically a good example of that.
Yeah, it's incredible that we're in times now where all of this seems plausible. All the dystopian books and movies that we've seen, it's, it's right there. Nobody doubts it. It's right ahead of us.
It's a worldwide dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
It is before our eyes. And in the 60s, they'd make programs like you could watch it on Star Trek or whatever, and it would be like, some far out idea or a Kurt Vonnegut novel or something. But here you go. They're basically saying, we want to take your kids and we'll decide what gender they are. And we're going to take you and say that unless you vote a certain way, you're dangerous. And, eventually the food part, now Bill Gates is the largest food farm landowner in America. That's very dangerous. He did it in a very sneaky fashion, actually, through shell corporations to do this. So he's up to no good. And, we all need to be very informed.
Didn't he also take over the seed vault?
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I brought that up in a report a couple of weeks ago, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. found out about this, tracked it down. How would you like to be Bill Gates with RFK Jr. on your tail? I don't know. I don't think so. Wouldn't feel good. But what he found out was that Gates had gone in, and those vaults that they had put aside for humanity, like the different seeds, it's kind of like a Noah's Ark type vault in Norway and places like that, that Gates had gone in and purchased them. He'd figured out how to kind of, bribe them or whatever. And he had gone in and bought those seed vaults, and then he had instantly started to convert the seeds to like a GMO type seed.
This really should be illegal, and I think there should be lawsuits against this.
I think that it needs to be.
There's
two things. I think
these seeds belong to the earth, and they belong to humanity itself, right? This cannot be privatized. There should be much more uproar about this.
No question.
Nobody, I don't care who they are, can be responsible for this. Is all our heritage and possibly our salvation if we ever need it. That's why it's in a vault.
Exactly. Oh no, it's absolutely true. You're 100% right. It's amazing too to me because when we look at it, from the point of view of somebody like Gates, he just thinks that he can do this. There are laws in different countries that he was able to get away with it, and now he's able to buy up the farmland here. And you have Anderson Cooper chumming around with him and saying like nice softball questions like, is it so hard to save humanity? Is it a big burden on your shoulders? Please share that with me. And Bill's like, no, I'll do anything I can to save everybody with an injection. This is Gates, and Gates was always known in tech circles as a real sleazebag. And this idea of Martin Luther Gates now is ridiculous. I mean, they really. All right. Yes.
Okay. So Esoteric 369 Wall, are there special forces down in the hot zone currently, Daniel?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's interesting. Farrell pointed out that there's a very unusual press conference that Trump gave. And I'm trying to think of the gentleman's name who was with him, but it was one of the 5-star generals, part of the Joint Chiefs, and he was saying, you will not get through. And they were supposedly talking about drugs, but they talked about how they were doubling down their forces in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean and that portion of the hot zone and Cuba and Venezuela all the way on the other side, that whole area becomes like a staging ground of some sort. We had some tension with those people. Russia's involved deeply with Venezuela. China's involved very deeply in the Bahamas. And so, we're looking at a huge group. Remember, let's go back to Edgarton Sykes. He was in British intelligence 30s, 40s, and 50s. This is a crucial period. They knew a lot. They were on the bullseye. They were facing off against Hitler. Every scrap of information was important. If he's saying that these groups are hunkered down over the hot zone, fighting over those ruins in a kind of a stealth fashion, that's then. That's back then. What is the situation now in 2021? I mean, this is why we need to understand and go into these things, not so much on a like, well, I'm curious about Atlantis. That's good, actually. It's a very interesting thing. but there's another level to it as well, which is it's fueling a lot of the geopolitics that we're seeing. So we have to understand that part by tapping into the few people who were able to get that message out, like Sykes, for example, and guys like Zink. And this goes back. I understand these guys have been dead for 40 years. Well, I mean, Sykes has been dead. I think that Zink maybe died a decade ago, but the legacy of his work is basically the 70s and the 80s. And but I will tell you, even with the UFO file, that's where you're finding the really good stuff. I don't know the major levels of commercialism and, the CIA junk, the TTSA type junk have taken over some, Gaia TV is supposed to pass for getting deeper knowledge. It doesn't cut it. They're just not, that's not where we can get the type of information that can be useful to a culture. It might be entertaining, but I would say that the thrust of the current period would be to bring forward an entirely new class of researcher around Atlantis, around the UFO file, around the HotZone, around these subjects. And I think we can do it. In the ideas room, I've already seen people who fit that mold. So we don't need to kind of complain about the people out there who are doing, a marketing job for this, like the Gaia TV crowd. I think that we can just move off in this other direction of really getting, being able to move the culture in this fashion. Yes.
This is very disturbing. So Nana said, check out Bite Lab, cloning human tissue from Hollywood stars for sale as meat.
Unbelievable.
We'll have to check into that.
I'm making a note. Right
there's
now.
nothing that would, I believe it. I'll check it to be sure, but
Whoa.
Nothing blows my mind anymore. If you can dream it, you can do it. There's sort of people are just there's nothing holding anybody back anymore. No sense of conscience.
Yes.
Why not? Why shouldn't we?
Right.
It's just.
Right,
go for it.
Selling young people's blood to older people.
Yeah,
there was this
it's like a quart of blood.
Unbelievable.
16 to 25.
So they were creating kind of like a, vampire market.
Mm-hmm.
This is a weird thing to do as well. It's like it's fascinating to me because a lot of this, when you talk about cloning and things like that, we did an episode, of course, that looked at Ted Williams and the cryogenic freezing and the company that was doing that. That's one of my favorite episodes because I can tell you that we reveal things in that episode which you won't find anywhere. And that's often true in the show that we do because we're open to the different levels of information. But it does give one pause when you're looking at the level that they're treating humanity as a commodity, and that it's getting more and more degraded to the point where they have this kind of cannibalistic thing. They actually have a guy out there who's used human cells and wants to develop a meat source with that. And, that sounds like it's exactly up Gates' alley. So we're looking at a very, the leadership is crazy, so they're operating from an insane level. If you think about on the political side, but also in industry, people like Bezos and stuff, they're just kind of crazy now. And the social media, the Zuckerberg, that whole thing, they've just gone out of the realm of having a really good answer for why they're doing the things that they're doing. And
it's human beings are a renewable resource.
Exactly.
That's it.
This is what Fitz points out so well. That's what they're trying to get us really plugged into. But we're not quite plugged in yet. And so, it's also the opinion of many people like Fitz that they're not going to get there. And so the question is going to be, after they destroy society, how are we going to make it sustainable to a point where we're going to be able to survive again? Because they're going to blow up their system. This is where a lot of these researchers are arriving at. They're not only arriving at the idea that you're going to enslave humanity, you're going to do these different things, but also in the process of doing that, their system is going to blow up. So what are we going to be left with afterwards? And, we've often thought about that. That was around a lot in the 80s with the nuclear idea that we've got these countries are going to bomb each other, and then what were we going to do to rebuild after that? Now I think we're looking at it and we're seeing deeper researchers saying these people are acting so crazy that even they've started to put out so much mind control that they've started to believe their own mind control. It's like a call response system. So now they're going crazy with their own junk. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 100. We've gone deep here into the hot zone with Maxwell and Epstein. And we're taking your questions. We're going to take some more questions. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, hang on a second. So MTRYP, what are your thoughts on Inner Earth? And do you think some of those hot zone sites are entrances?
I've heard people who are very well versed in on the Atlantean side suggest it as a possibility. I've also heard about it as a dimensional style possibility. That is, there are other dimensions intermingling with ours. You know, when you talk about really deep psychics and people like Steiner giving us that indication from the mystery school side, they talk about things like fairies, and they talk about nature spirits. And when we talk about, you know, Findhorn and groups of this ilk, their whole setup for the remarkable things they did with agriculture is that they claimed they were consciously interacting with that type of a being. So you can see that there are levels that get hard for an average person to understand, and yet, like all the people in the ideas room, I've always been available to look at those different realities. And at a certain point, it makes sense to me that there's a different class of being operating. And so the idea, you know, you always get fantasy stuff around this or whatever. What's the guy, you know, there's always this kind of like, the Inner Earth people gave me this, you know, magic talisman, and here I am. I think of it as a little bit different. I really do think that there's a parallel realm, you know, like the astral realm operating with ours, and that we do encounter those beings. I think the stories have been remarkable over the years. So definitely something like that's possible. No question.
Stormboy Boy, is the Nixon time capsule lost to the CIA at this time?
Well, we went very deep on the Nixon time capsule. When Merritt died, I don't think, you know, I don't think there was anything else that he was going to admit about it. Oddly enough, he did say that Nixon had said about 2020 that it was going to be a disaster for America and the world, and he turned out to be quite correct. But I believe he got that prediction from Gene Dixon. So it is very interesting. When you get right down to the Nixon time capsule, here's the kind of snapshot that we can take from all of that, which is that Nixon was very advanced on the UFO file, and that because of the scandals that were breaking, he felt he wasn't going to get credit, and that he had already funded a UFO disclosure documentary. Remember that. He put it together, his administration. So what was he ready to do? So we know that for a fact. We also know that Merritt is a major, if you look at any Watergate researcher, they understand who Merritt was, that he was in that. And when I spoke to Merritt and spent hours, I mean, I spoke with him for hours, and he was not a person who was interested in the UFO file at all. This is the irony. So the idea that he would just make up a story about Nixon and keeping this UFO information in a time capsule doesn't make sense. What actually makes sense is that his story was 100% true, and that the time capsule became a geopolitical plaything during the Trump era and between two sides looking for it. And we have some indication that they found it, but that's where the information starts to get sketchy. But we certainly know that it existed. Yes.
So there were some questions before about where CERN fits in with all of this.
Well, it's interesting. I wonder if I can get this part out. This is about Lawrence Krauss. Now, let's get a few things about Krauss. He's an American-Canadian theoretical physicist and cosmologist who previously taught at Arizona State University. However, he was ousted because sexual misconduct. What did he lead up? He led up the Epstein Atlantis submarine tour for all the physicists. And he has pictures of him underwater with the sub looking at things. So he was very deeply involved in this. He currently serves as the president of the Origins Project Foundation. Again, Origins. They're going back to remake the story of humanity. He's an advocate for public understanding of science, public policy, and based on sound empirical data. Well, this is more like a, it's like a real marketing advertisement for him, but this is the encyclopedia entry on him. Let's see where the Krauss info is. He was involved in that whole thing, and he shows up as a very suspicious character in the middle of it, but he is promoting this whole side of things. And then, he's so deep into the middle of that oceanography research, and he puts together the meetings with Epstein and Stephen Hawking. So we can see his connections from being a physicist are deeply tied into the projects that Maxwell is doing. One of the things I would say is that it becomes so absurd and bizarre that Terramar ceases to exist as soon as Epstein gets in trouble. And this is what a lot of those headlines didn't understand. Ghislaine Maxwell abruptly torpedoed her oceanic nonprofit in the wake of the scandal surrounding her associate, Jeffrey Epstein. They had to get rid of that info, and what they did was they closed it down, and the only address left for it was a little place in Woburn. So nobody's really ever going to know what it was actually up to. But there's a couple of interesting points that I'll make off this article, and we'll get back to your questions. Ghislaine Maxwell jettisoned her environmental nonprofit just days after her longtime associate Epstein was arrested on sex trafficking charges. Think about that. Terramar was deeply involved with the Epstein enterprise, and she could not afford the Atlantis part of that to come out. She was going to get investigated. Instead, she canned the corporation. She had founded the Terramar Project in 2012 to encourage the conservancy of the high seas. That's good. Business Insider reviewed the nonprofit's tax documents and found that Maxwell had been pouring thousands of dollars into the venture. There's a lot there with Terramar, and it's going to, as we get deeper into episode 2 and 3 of 100 here, of X Series 100, then we're going to get even deeper. She said, Maxwell described her thinking around the high seas, which she described as a land called Terramar. All citizens of the world are citizens of Terramar, or citizens of the high seas, if you will, part of the global commons. Adding that her organization's website would foster a sense of identity by giving out digital Terramar passports. So if you go deeper, well, actually, I'm going to see what she says here. Quote, this is Ghislaine now in her own words. You'll get a digital passport with your name and your ID number, and you will be able to follow the progress of the high seas, anything that happens significant on the high seas. Now you'll be able to find out what's going on. We have 1.5 million marine species. You can select one to be the ambassador to Terramar and be the spokesperson for that species. You can sponsor a piece of the ocean, or maybe buy a piece of the ocean a lot, looking for that piece of land that's going to rise. Quite interesting, though, when we get into Terramar, but we'll have to save that for the next one. Yes.
Chris Cousins, given what Dr. Farrell says about the effect CERN has on the Earth's magnetic field, I wonder if they're trying to replicate the effects of the stone without having the stone.
Yes.
Interesting question.
I'm sure they have their own version for sure. I think that when you really look at the Two-Eyed Stone and the story of the Two-Eyed Stone in the reading, he makes it very clear that in the Hall of Records, the records for the construction of same still exist. So this is something that they're certainly after. It's a little thinner when he talks about the malfunctioning, the Two-Eyed Stone that destroyed things, especially on the East Coast. But when he talks about the disruptions, he talks about inundations and complete catastrophe. And many people think that was a comet hit. This is what they're thinking. I understand that too, and there have been comet hits that have changed the trajectory. But the Two-Eyed Stone may have had the effect of something like an extreme comet hit. But there's this overshadow piece of it, a phasing of magnetic energy, which is, you could call it reality distortion. And so the thing that seems to mimic this effect, what we've called apotheum in the show, are UFOs, oddly enough. So it's like they come in and they distort the magnetic field. And so, we could be looking at something with the UFO aspect that the trajectory that they come in on has to do with the magnetic field of the Earth. And so I don't think that it's like we don't understand enough about that destruction. But certainly the way that they study the Two-Eyed Stone from their point of view, they've been able to study the Bermuda Triangle since the 1940s. There's a interesting story by Thomas Tonson Brown about going to Cuba in 1930 as part of a Navy experiment to test out an extremely advanced sub for the period. And when he goes there and they're testing it out, there's a massive earthquake, the biggest. And he talks about how terrifying it was. But it's interesting, the combination of things. And at the end of that project, he's invited on to this incredible yacht. And he realizes the person who invited him is this incredibly huge power broker. And he suggests it's kind of like a secret government type guy. This guy shows him in glass the original version of Alice in Wonderland, which, we've tied in with the Orphic Circle, and we've done a number of episodes on that going back in the X series here. What he says is that it was kept in this interesting glass container. And he said, "What? Can I see that? Like, why is it in here?" And the guy says to him, if the ship ever sank, this thing would still survive the version in it. But it's all very unusual. So, my answer to your question comes in this kind of circuitous route, but there's something very unusual about the magnetic aspect of the HotZone, which lends itself to a complete reality transformation, especially on a physics level. That's from everything that I've read. It seems over and over again, you're not dealing with the normal rules of universal physical laws. Yes.
Tessa 1111 says CERN popped us into another timeline.
Yeah. That's what the question was. I'm sorry, I missed that. There was a person who was involved with Krauss, and they were a big part of CERN, and there was a major representative of CERN in that Atlantis sub-expedition. That's what that point was. Okay, yeah.
Did you get that question? That
CERN start again, yes.
Tessa 1111, CERN popped us into another timeline.
Yeah.
I think there's something really shifted around 2012, if you really look back, where something does not feel normal anymore. Something feels innately different about what we're dealing with, darker. We got into a darker timeline after that. Just looking back at my life, even pop culture, I don't know, maybe it has, you could say it has something to do with the iPhones, changing our consciousness. But it wasn't actually like 2008, 2009 and the housing crisis. It was 2012. And since then, things have felt off, really. And like literally on a different train track, where we don't know how to get back to the other timeline.
Yes.
If we could even, I don't know. What do you think?
it's all very fascinating because, of course, 2020 was more like the 2012 that was promised, right?
Mm.
So there's an interface there. No, I absolutely believe in timelines, and I think that they've, what Farrell says is that they have groups there that are trying to play with the medium, and that's where the Mandela effect and things like that come from. That's a kind of conjuring up of that reality distortion aspect. When I think about it, when I think about the things that they do, I always go back to the abduction experience, because when you think about that and the reports about it, and then you think about this technology that's being hidden, the X technology, that's what they have in common, which is the UFO aspect changes everything. It shuts power lines off. It creates magnetic disturbances. Plants won't grow. So they have a varying effect physically on people. Some people have reported benefits from having encounters with aliens. Other people, like Barney Hill, for example, seemed like he went down pretty hard after having his experience. It was too much. And so it depends on who you encounter in that. But I would say that what's happening is when you're operating in a different reality, that's what's so interesting about those stories, really, because so many good people have gone on the record about the UFO experiences that, yeah, you can always say, well, there's a certain amount who are just influenced by pop culture or whatever, but how did it get there in the first place? Too many people were already having those experiences. If you go back into ancient times, they had those experiences. So there's obviously a doorway there. And one of the things that comes up in this three-parter is the Tua de Danann also. And there's a record of a culture that seems almost mythical, and yet there's actual physical records of them in Ireland. Yes.
Dash Rendar, is there a Ghislaine left-hand mystery school connection? Her twin sisters created a tech company, Gilead,
Yes.
used by most countries for customs border control. Gilead is mentioned in the Bible.
Interesting. Yes. On their level, the Maxwells, I would say they have a deep, Epstein himself, that's deep occult on both sides. And of course, there's all kinds of Atlantean symbolism on the island as well. But certainly when you get on that level, there's a kind of occult initiation into the left-hand path that you have to take or you're out. It's just like if you're not in the CFR, you're basically hanging out there alone. You can go out in any scandal. But I would say absolutely there's a deep connection. And I would say it is definitely on that kind of OTO tip with the Maxwells.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the OTO?
They come up actually in the next episode.
Oh, okay. All right.
The Order Templi Orientis, and of course, well known for their association with Crowley. But yeah, it's very a group that operates on the normal mystery school side, but then adopts a kind of a black magic aspect, and is definitely a very hidden group. Yes.
Ascending Starseed. Daniel, which book from Steiner do you recommend most to learn more about Ahriman and the Eighth Sphere?
Well, it's interesting because the lectures that he did on Ahriman, remember the Eighth Sphere is mentioned sparingly. This is the interesting thing. It wasn't supposed to come out, but there was a major theosophist who came forward with it in a book called Esoteric Buddhism, and he misidentified the Eighth Sphere in a dangerous way and called it the moon. But the Eighth Sphere doesn't have, it's not a fully formed sphere, so it couldn't be anything like the moon. So in terms of getting information out, Steiner was compelled, because of what A.P. Sinnott put out, to basically bring the real thing out about the Eighth Sphere. The Eighth Sphere is very important for this period of time because we see people very often going into virtual reality with the computer control and with the technology control of their thinking. That's all Eighth Sphere activity, and it's meant to trap a sovereign, independent spiritual mind into, this culture which pretends to be a normal chain of evolution. And as bizarre as it sounds, so much of the eighth sphere is like virtual reality that to me, this is really the time when they're trying to harvest that. And if you look at Steiner's version, what he's saying is, look, the harmonic forces want to continue to rule over humanity. But there's a point where humanity is advancing and evolving, and it will evolve to this stage of the new Jupiter, which is the new Earth in a sense. This is almost like a biblical prophecy. So the harmonic forces are set up to prevent this from taking place. And so the deflection is, and the deception of it, in Steiner's cosmology, is if they can get us into the eighth sphere instead, and we still think, that we're doing the right thing, that we're in our culture, we're just moving in with the society, fitting in with the society. But what they're doing is they're forcing our consciousness into separating from our spirituality. So when you hear things like Neuralink and Musk talking about putting his consciousness in a cube and stuff like that, that's very eighth sphere stuff. It's like textbook, which is what always grabs me, because Steiner's writing 100 years ago. How did he know? How did he know? He's obviously seeing things from that spiritual level. And what does that suggest about all of us? That we can all do that. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions.
Okay. Cylindro Andromeda, please talk about Blavatsky in the hot zone.
There's an episode, Blavatsky in the hot zone.
Is it called Blavatsky in the hot zone?
Yes. No, she's like, there's a very interesting tie with Cuba and the Theosophical Society. And Henry Alcott was down there. But Blavatsky, the way that she moved is interesting. She identified so many things going on there in the hot zone. She also identified the development of these kind of the things. And I think we're going to have to really identify the things, because it sounds so much like what they're trying to do with the cyber robots and things of this nature. Casey identifies the things, the untouchables that the Atlanteans developed. At times he calls them thought forms. So, but what they are in general is a kind of a mutant cyborg. And he also talks about the half animal, half human thing that they had done through their experiments. So, and then he talks about when they show up in Egypt, they have all these things as slaves. So there's a major aspect of that on the lower side of the Atlantean part. When she talks about it, I feel like she's really giving us a warning about the current period of time. I always say when it comes to Blavatsky versus Steiner, looking out into the future, it's fascinating for me, because in Theosophy, you will see that they look out into the future and they say, well, the human, the sixth root race is coming, and that human being has psychic ability, is more spiritually in touch, and all these great things will happen. The world teacher is going to be here. And so they have a very optimistic, they kind of go on that optimistic track. And the Steiner anthroposophical edge says, no, wait. In the 21st century, you're going to clash with Ahriman. That's what's in the future, and we have to benefit from that, or the entire evolutionary pattern gets thrown off, and humanity actually is in very great trouble, great danger of a kind of a false evolution into the eighth sphere. So they're very interesting to me, because they're both major mystery schools, and Steiner came out of Theosophy, as we know. So it's interesting to me that Steiner doesn't say that things are going to be bad in the future, but he's saying, this is that period. And I will say that in the Casey work, there's a mix, because he talks about how we are moving into this more enlightened age eventually. But he also talks about Armageddon, seen from an esoteric point of view, as being a war in the sky, and that we have to go through that. So, it's like a strange, it's hard to figure out when you look out from all these different mystery school perspectives. Obviously we're projecting for the best and getting through it, but it sounds like there's a tremendous battle to be had. And we're already seeing the outlines of those battles when you have a very small group of people insisting that everybody get an experimental injectable technology. Obviously, they're trying to control the great mass of humanity. There's no way around it. But I think there's room for both Steiner's and Theosophy's outcomes there, although it's interesting to me that they present differently. Steiner's really almost like Paul Revere in this sense. And in this sense, the Armand force is coming. Yes.
I got to finish with this one. Michael Winstonley. Can DJ expand on Steiner's spider beings coming to control us, please?
Well, he does a lot of very interesting interpretations. And he also talks about, like the Armonic force is a series of groups, and that in the East, they've identified them as these various demons. And but he's talked about the spider beings, and he has also talked about various levels of our own development, where he talks about flower men and stuff like that. So he goes really deep. Someone's asked about a book suggestion earlier on Steiner. One of the books, of course, his classic book is Knowledge of Higher Worlds, which is like Steiner's hit single. It's so easy to understand. And, most of his books are deep and dense, like his book Theosophy, which J. Allen Hynek said he found the truth about UFOs in that book, which is interesting when you think about it.
Did he say what it was?
No, but obviously it suggests that it's more of an interdimensional aspect. That's what Hynek thought. But the other book is Cosmic Memory, and I can still remember the first time that I read Cosmic Memory. It completely changed my viewpoint. I completely understood things in a new way. That's the power of Steiner's work 100 years later. But Cosmic Memory is just all about our earliest beginnings in Atlantis and Lemuria and the types of beings that we were and what that evolutionary track is all about. An outline of occult science is a good one to go to after that. And his series of lectures dealing with Ahriman. Remember this, that around the time of World War I, Steiner kept that material only for students. And then during World War I, he said, you know what? The mystery schools, it's not working for humanity because they're all bombing the hell out of each other. I'm going to release all this stuff. So the Ahriman material comes out of that. And it was a move like the move in 1840 by the mystery schools that said, we have to let these things out because the scientific materialism is closing in. The Ahrimanic forces are having their way, and we need to give them a way to buffer this. And it's interesting, the first kind of efforts at that were people like the Poughkeepsie Seer, who could see into other worlds. And then reincarnation came out. It started to be released. And then they try to put, some of the mystery schools were like, no, you can't let the reincarnation part, put that back. And so there were weird back and forth things about reincarnation. And then finally, Blavatsky is the big trade-off of all the mystery school revelations. She's the one who can come out and present it. And there's still mysteries about Blavatsky that Steiner and people don't understand. The level at which she was able to apprehend the information she did and get it out to the public. It's not very clear. She was working with masters, etc., but still, her ability, like someone like Blavatsky hadn't been seen in something like 2,000 years. And it's very interesting because supposedly both sides of the mystery schools were aware of her birth. So when we look at Blavatsky's material, we can keep all that in mind. Yes.
I just want to address this. MA says, anyone else feel helpless? And I just wanted to say that I got off Twitter over a month ago.
Yeah.
Which was my only social media account. I feel so much more grounded. I feel more like myself. My nervous system is reset. I feel smarter because I have a better memory. because I'm not overstimulated. I'm starting to sleep better, and I am not feeling as helpless. So I think that personally, I think that social media is incredibly
Disempowering.
It's disempowering. It's I don't think it's good for the human psyche. And I mean, there are benefits to it, and I do miss people, connecting to people on it. But I know for myself, it's too much all the time. It's just this influx. We need to have boundaries around our psyche, around our energy body, and it's allowing people constantly having access to other people, their minds, the minds of the world, the community, and having them have access to your mind. All this, my friend Charlotte, what did she call it? It's not coming to me. It's like a psychic transfer constantly.
Yes, yeah.
And
there's no question that it can be. I mean,
you lose yourself in it.
Yes.
And I would say, if anybody's feeling helpless, take a little time out of social media. And, it's not even like I've been gardening or anything like that, but I feel much better.
Yes.
And
and
so
everyone's saying,
and I'm very sensitive.
People are saying, good for you, Olivia.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's fascinating what happens. That energy all comes back to you almost immediately.
Quantum psychic entanglement.
Yes.
That is her phrase.
Yeah, excellent
and
phrase.
ain't it the truth?
Absolutely. And on that note, everyone, we are going to leave you. But I think that's great advice, by the way. Thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs.
Hold on. I have so many people to thank.
Thank you.
For super chats. Okay. Vern Baumgartner, Lisa Frequency, Sarcastic Warlock, Gillenjoy R, Bill Gometz, Eurythmia's Fun, Shazam, Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, Occult Fan, Doreen Hewitt, Angel P, Charles Marlowe, Matt M, Josh Randall, Joseph Fabry, Doyle Wayne, Carol Crumlish, Debbie McAdoo, Brian Berner, Stephen Talbot, GDNPB, Carrie Keegan, Ascending Starseed, and Shanjak. Thank you so much for your generous super chats. We appreciate it.
Incredible, unbelievable support. Really appreciate it for our efforts here on X Series episode 100. And we really thank you for your support. And to all our subscribers, thank you very much. We will be back next Friday with X Series 100 Part 2. Which is going to go even deeper on these aspects. And I'll do a couple of quick shout outs here. We Are Sovereign. I like that name, of course. Scarlet Fire, Silver Fox, Shazam, Occult Fan, Najat Madri. It's great to see you out there. Katie Cat, Wayne Peak, Brandini Mancini. That's great. Where's Mr. Wonderful? That's my name. So Tessa1111, Al Kaider, Catherine Harris, fantastic. Tricky Vicky, excellent. Frank Monday, Eurythmia is fun. I agree. It certainly is. HODL Crypto, that's it. Well, it's a lot of cryptos out there, but it's tricky stuff. PM Chan, Brenda Fisher, Cheryl Peterson, Steiner to God, Charles Marlowe. Wow, great questions and the ideas from tonight. Over the top. Of course, the Golden Girl. Kate's out there. It's great to see you. No Sheeple. I agree. We will see you all. Debbie McAdoo, also Daniel Browning. Wow, great people. Ideas from really came through tonight. And Miss Olivia, fantastic.
I sort of don't want to turn off the chat. It's been so fun being back.
It's fantastic. Well, Gotham City needs you, as we know. And we will be back. Now, we're coming back next Friday. And in this three-parter, you may find some very interesting guests popping up.
Yes, we have a special guest next week, don't we?
Exactly. So keep it in mind. And we also appreciate you going to darkjournalist.com, signing up for the newsletter. Make sure that we stay in touch. And while you're there, if you feel like getting behind the program, subscribe there. And we have some very exciting features coming up for our members. And we will leave you with that. And Miss Olivia, you get the last word.
Just love you all. I missed you a lot, and it's really nice to be back.
Fantastic.
So-
You did an incredible job.
Thank you.
And the amount of fan mail that just pouring in for you, it's ridiculous. But no, it's great. It's great. And Dash Render, great people. Carl Jung, fantastic. We will see you all next week, and have a gret weekend, everybody.
Yeah, I also wanted to reassure everybody that DJ goes through the entire ideas room chat.
Yes.
And reviews all of the comments that weren't read and all of the ideas.
Always.
And,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
No, it's
and
incredible.
so everything will be read.
It's also, it's a great interaction of ideas.
Absolutely.
There in
It's
the
a think
ideas
tank.
room. It is quite unusual and unlike anything else, and we appreciate it. And 3 years of the X series.
Yay.
Congratulations. Nicely done.
Huge accomplishment, DJ.
And I feel like, all of us together have really gone through these interesting 3 years. You will not believe the things I think are coming up for us. And we're going to have some very exciting shows coming up for you as well here in March. So have a great night, everyone. And, it says end broadcast, but it goes on and on.
And on and on.
Have a great night and a great weekend.
God bless.
See you soon.